The creation of the Emperor's children began in the gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, where the Emperor's greatest biological work was undertaken in utmost secrecy. Unlike the other legions formed during the first founding, the Third Legion received special attention from the gene rights of the Selenar cults, who had been brought to compliance during the early unification wars. These moonborn gene smiths possessed techniques unknown even to some of the Emperor's own scientists, allowing for a level of precision in genetic manipulation that bordered on the artistic. The Selenar cultists worked with the Emperor's genetic template for the Third Legion, applying their arcane bioalchemical methods to refine the already perfect genetic material. They employed rare cellular cultivation techniques involving controlled radiation exposure and chemical catalysts that accelerated gene seed development without sacrificing stability. The gene seed of the Third Legion was noted for its remarkable purity and lack of deviation from the original template, a characteristic that would later become central to the Legion's identity and eventual downfall. Initial implantation trials showed exceptional compatibility rates, with recruits displaying enhanced cognitive function and physical coordination beyond even the baseline expectations for Astartes. The first warriors of the Third Legion emerged from their transformation with a distinctive phenotype, pale skin that seemed almost luminous under certain lighting conditions, and a symmetry of features that reflected the perfection encoded in their gene seed. Their reflexes tested at the upper boundaries of Astartes' capability, while their sensory acuity, particularly in matters of taste, touch, and aesthetic discrimination, surpassed that of their brother legions. When the Third Legion was first mustered in the 30th millennium, they numbered approximately 7,000 battle-ready Astartes. Their first deployment came during the latter stages of the Unification Wars, where they distinguished themselves in the pacification of the Caucasus wastes. Fighting alongside Thunder Warriors in their final campaigns, the Third Legion demonstrated discipline and precision that contrasted sharply with the brutal efficiency of the Emperor's earlier creations. Where the Thunder Warriors would devastate, the Third Legion would surgically excise resistance with minimal collateral damage, a trait that earned them early recognition from the Emperor himself. The Legion operated without their Primarch for several decades, developing a martial culture centered on precision and excellence. Under the command of Lord Commander Eidolon, one of the first Terran-born officers, they cultivated a meritocratic ethos where achievement in battle was measured not merely by victories secured, but by the manner of their execution. This perfectionist tendency, already present in their genetic makeup, would find its ultimate expression when they were finally united with their gene father. Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Third Legion, came to rest on the world of Chemos, a mining colony in the Ultima Segmentum that had been isolated from Terra since the Age of Strife. Once a thriving industrial center, Chemos had degenerated into a resource-depleted wasteland where human survival hung by the thinnest margin. The planet's atmosphere had grown toxic from millennia of unchecked industrial activity, forcing its inhabitants to dwell in sealed hive cities connected by enclosed transport tubes. Outside these protective environments, nothing grew on the barren surface, which had been strip-mined to exhaustion. The society that developed on Chemos was entirely geared toward efficiency and conservation. Every citizen was expected to contribute to the collective survival, with no allowance for leisure or artistic pursuits. Resources were so scarce that water was recycled countless times, and the dead were processed to reclaim their chemical components. Children deemed too weak or deformed to contribute effectively were euthanized, a practice that makes the survival of the infant Primarch all the more remarkable. Fulgrim's gestation pod crashed into a mining facility on the outskirts of Kallax, one of the 3 remaining city-states on Chemos. The workers who discovered him recognized something extraordinary in the perfect infant, and breaking with their society's pragmatic customs, chose to spare him. This decision was vindicated as the child grew at an accelerated rate, speaking fluently within weeks and mastering complex industrial processes within months. By adolescence, Fulgrim had revolutionized extraction techniques in the depleted mines, increasing yields by nearly 50% and introducing more efficient recycling methods that reduced waste to unprecedented levels. His innovations allowed, for the first time in generations, a small surplus of resources. Rather than hoarding this bounty, Fulgrim directed it toward cultural revitalization, establishing schools for arts and philosophy that had been absent from Chemos for millennia. Fulgrim's vision extended beyond mere survival. He believed that humanity was meant for greatness, for beauty and achievement beyond the grinding subsistence that had become the norm on Chemos. Under his leadership, Calyx began to transform from a utilitarian industrial center into a city where efficiency served a higher purpose, the cultivation of human potential in all its forms. The other city-states, witnessing this renaissance, eventually accepted Fulgrim's authority without bloodshed, an unusual achievement among the Primarchs, most of whom unified their adoptive worlds through conquest. By the time the Emperor's Great Crusade reached Chemos, Fulgrim had transformed the planet. The hive cities gleamed with architectural embellishments, while factories operated with a precision that allowed for both productivity and aesthetics. The population, once dwindling, had stabilized and begun to grow again. Most significantly, Chemos had developed a unique cultural ethos that balanced pragmatic efficiency with artistic excellence, a philosophy that would later infuse the Third Legion. The meeting between the Emperor and Fulgrim has been recorded in various historical texts, with the most reliable accounts describing a moment of immediate recognition between father and son. Unlike some Primarchs who questioned or even resisted their intended destiny, Fulgrim embraced it wholeheartedly. He saw in the Emperor the ultimate expression of the perfectionist ideals he had cultivated on Chemos, and in the Imperium, the grandest canvas imaginable for humanity's potential. The Emperor, recognizing Fulgrim's unique qualities, spent several days in private conversation with his rediscovered son before presenting him to the waiting Third Legion. These discussions covered not only military strategy and imperial governance, but also philosophy, art, and the Emperor's vision for human cultural evolution. Fulgrim absorbed these teachings with characteristic intensity, integrating them into his existing worldview and emerging with an unshakable devotion to the imperial truth. When Fulgrim was finally united with his legion, however, he found not the mighty force he had anticipated, but a shadow of what should have been. The Third Legion had suffered a catastrophe unique in the annals of the Astartes, the Blight. This mysterious malady had struck the Legion approximately 4 decades after its founding, while engaged in compliance operations in the Kenuit system. Initial symptoms included degraded combat performance and increased fatigue, progressing rapidly to cellular breakdown at the genetic level. Apothecaries determined that the gene seed itself had been corrupted, though whether through enemy action, environmental contamination, or some inherent flaw remained unclear. The spread was exponential, with healthy battle brothers falling ill after receiving emergency field gene seed implants from their dying comrades. Within 18 months, the once proud Third Legion had been reduced from over 7,000 Astartes to fewer than 200 functional warriors. This remnant was recalled to Terra, where the Emperor's own genitors managed to isolate and neutralize the corruption, saving the Legion from extinction, but unable to restore its numbers quickly. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound. They developed a siege mentality, viewing themselves as the last guardians of a precious bloodline that had nearly been lost. Every battle became not merely a military engagement, but an existential test, with the Legion's very survival at stake. When Fulgrim took command of these survivors, he addressed them with a speech that has been preserved in Legion records. He spoke not of their diminished numbers, but of their undiminished spirit, declaring that it was not quantity but quality that defined true greatness. He vowed that under his leadership, they would rebuild not merely to their former strength, but beyond it, becoming the exemplars of what the Astartes were meant to be. This moment marked the true birth of the Emperor's children, as they would come to be known throughout the Great Crusade. Fulgrim instituted rigorous new training protocols that emphasized not only combat efficiency, but also cultural refinement. His Chemos-born philosophy, which held that true mastery required both technical perfection and aesthetic understanding, became the Legion's guiding principle. Every Astartes was expected to study art, literature, and music alongside tactics and weapons training, developing what Fulgrim called the complete warrior. The rebuilt Legion adopted purple and gold as their colors, purple representing imperial authority dating back to ancient Terra, and gold symbolizing perfection and achievement. Their armor was maintained to an immaculate standard, with even battle damage repaired and polished before warriors would rest after combat. Their weapons were not merely tools, but expressions of martial artistry, often embellished with engravings and inlays that told the story of their wielders' accomplishments. Most significantly, the Emperor granted the Third Legion a unique honor that set them apart from all others: permission to bear the imperial aquila upon their armor. This double-headed eagle was the Emperor's personal symbol, representing his dominion over both the material and spiritual realms of humanity. No other legion was permitted this distinction, which recognized both Fulgrim's absolute loyalty and the exemplary conduct of his warriors. The right to bear the aquila transformed the Third Legion into literal Emperor's children, a name they adopted formally after the honor was bestowed. This privilege carried tremendous psychological weight. For a legion that had nearly faced extinction, to be singled out for such recognition validated their survival and their approach to warfare. It also created an immense pressure to live up to this mark of favor, intensifying their already perfectionist tendencies. Every action taken by an Astartes bearing the aquila was understood to reflect directly upon the Emperor himself, requiring a standard of conduct beyond reproach. The Third Legion's recovery from the Blight was gradual but determined. Fulgrim personally oversaw the selection of new recruits, drawing primarily from chemos, but also accepting candidates from other compliant worlds that displayed appropriate physical and intellectual potential. The implantation process was conducted with unprecedented care, with success rates significantly higher than most other legions due to the direct involvement of Fulgrim and his senior apothecaries. As their numbers slowly increased, the Emperor's children developed distinctive combat doctrines that emphasized precision over brute force. They specialized in rapid strike operations, decapitation attacks against enemy leadership, and perfection of specific combat forms rather than generalized battlefield roles. Each company, and eventually each chapter as the Legion grew, cultivated particular areas of expertise that could be deployed in complementary fashion, creating a force that was both specialized and adaptable. The infant that would become Fulgrim arrived on chemos in a blazing meteor that tore through the toxic atmosphere and crashed into the outskirts of Kallax, one of the planet's last 3 surviving city-states. The mining facility workers who discovered the perfect child faced a profound dilemma. Chemos was a world of ruthless efficiency where even the slightest imperfection could condemn a newborn to death. Resources were too scarce to support those who could not contribute. Yet something in this child's flawless features and alert gaze stayed their hands. The workers named him Fulgrim, a name derived from an ancient Chemosian word meaning the brilliant one. The name proved prophetic as the child developed at an extraordinary rate, speaking perfectly within weeks and mastering complex industrial processes before his first year. By adolescence, he stood taller than any man on Chemos, his physical perfection matched only by his intellect and charisma. Chemos itself was a dying world. Once a prosperous mining colony during the dark age of technology, millennia of isolation and resource exploitation had left it barren. Its atmosphere had grown toxic from unchecked industrial pollution, forcing the population into sealed hive cities. Outside these protective environments, nothing grew on the strip-mined surface. The society had developed a utilitarian philosophy where efficiency was the highest virtue and waste the gravest sin. Every citizen worked in the factories or mines from childhood until death, with no time for leisure or artistic pursuits. Fulgrim's first contribution to his adoptive world came at age 15, when he redesigned extraction equipment in the depleted mines, increasing yields by nearly 50%. He followed this achievement with innovations in recycling technology that further reduced waste. These advancements marked the first time in generations that Kallax produced a small surplus of resources. Rather than merely stockpiling these precious materials, Fulgrim made a decision that revealed his unique vision. He allocated a portion of the surplus to establish schools for arts, philosophy, and sciences, disciplines that had been abandoned on Chemos for millennia as impractical luxuries. When questioned by the city's governing factors, Fulgrim argued that efficiency without purpose was meaningless. True greatness, he maintained, lay not merely in survival, but in the cultivation of human potential in all its forms. "We have forgotten what we are preserving ourselves for," he reportedly told the factors. Mere existence is not enough. This philosophy spread from Kallax to the neighboring city-states of Kallaxes and Ignato, not through conquest but through example. As Kallax began to flourish culturally while maintaining its newfound prosperity, the other cities gradually accepted Fulgrim's leadership. Within a decade, he had unified Chemos under his rule without shedding a drop of blood, an achievement unique among the scattered Primarchs. Under Fulgrim's guidance, Chemos underwent a transformation. The hive cities, once purely functional structures, began to incorporate architectural embellishments. Factories operated with a precision that allowed for both productivity and aesthetic consideration. Most significantly, the population began to embrace a cultural ethos that balanced pragmatic efficiency with artistic excellence, a philosophy that would later define the Emperor's Children Legion. When the Emperor's Great Crusade reached Chemos in the early 31st millennium, Imperial advance scouts found not the desperate dying world they expected, but a planet in the midst of Renaissance. The meeting between Fulgrim and the Emperor has been recorded in various historical texts, with the most reliable accounts describing an immediate recognition between them. Unlike some Primarchs who questioned their intended destiny, Fulgrim embraced it without hesitation. The Emperor spent several days in private conversation with his rediscovered son, discussing not only military strategy and imperial governance, but also philosophy, art, and the grand vision for humanity's future. Fulgrim absorbed these teachings with characteristic intensity, seeing in the Emperor the ultimate expression of the perfectionist ideals he had cultivated on Chemos, and in the Imperium, the grandest possible canvas for humanity's potential. When Fulgrim finally took command of the Third Legion, his perfectionist philosophy found its ultimate expression in military form. He instituted training regimens that emphasized not only combat proficiency, but cultural refinement. Under his guidance, the Emperor's children developed into warriors who could discuss theoretical architecture while executing perfect battle formations, or recite classical poetry while cleaning their bolters to immaculate standards. Fulgrim's physical appearance embodied his legion's ideals. Standing slightly taller than most Primarchs, his proportions were flawlessly balanced. His features combined strength with classical beauty, framed by flowing silver-white hair that reached his shoulders. His skin held a pale luminosity that seemed to catch and reflect light. Most striking were his eyes, deep purple that could shift from warm approval to cold judgment in an instant. He typically wore armor of purple and gold, often embellished with eagles and lightning bolts, maintaining it in immaculate condition even during the most grueling campaigns. The Primarch's perfectionism extended to his personal combat style. Where some of his brothers relied on overwhelming strength or berserker fury, Fulgrim approached warfare as a discipline to be mastered through study and practice. He was known to spend hundreds of hours perfecting a single sword stroke, seeking the ideal balance of efficiency and elegance. This dedication made him one of the most technically accomplished warriors among the Primarchs, capable of defeating opponents through precision rather than brute force. Among his brother Primarchs, Fulgrim formed particularly close bonds with those who shared his appreciation for craftsmanship and excellence. His most notable brotherhood was with Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands. The two first met shortly after Fulgrim's discovery, when the Emperor brought his newly found son to Mars. There, Fulgrim encountered the Gorgon in the great forge complex known as the Urdesh Beehive. Their initial meeting sparked a competition, each claiming they could craft a better weapon than the other. Ferrus Manus forged a perfect power sword with his bare hands, the metal yielding to his living metal hands. Fulgrim created an ornate warhammer on an anvil of screaming faces. When they exchanged their creations, a lifelong brotherhood was born. Fulgrim named his new sword Fireblade, while Ferrus called his hammer Forgebreaker. This exchange symbolized their complementary natures, Ferrus embodying unadorned functionality, Fulgrim representing the marriage of function with aesthetic perfection. Their brotherhood extended to the battlefield, where their legions frequently fought side by side. The methodical precision of the Iron Hands complemented the artistic perfection of the Emperor's children, creating combined forces of remarkable effectiveness. During the compliance of Diasporex, the two Primarchs led their legions in a masterful void battle against Xeno's vessels, demonstrating their tactical synchronicity. Fulgrim also maintained cordial relations with Bute Gilliman of the Ultramarines, whose organizational genius he respected, and with Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, whose innate grace and beauty resonated with Fulgrim's aesthetic sensibilities. His relationship with Horus Lupercal of the Luna Wolves was more complex. While he admired the War Master's charisma and strategic brilliance, there remained an undercurrent of competition between them. With other Primarchs, particularly those like Mortarion of the Death Guard or Angron of the World Eaters, Fulgrim maintained a polite distance. Their differing approaches to warfare and contrasting philosophies provided little common ground for brotherhood. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor's children established a reputation for flawless execution of complex military operations. Under Fulgrim's leadership, they specialized in precision strikes, decapitation attacks against enemy leadership, and perfection of specific combat forms. Their campaigns were characterized not by the number of worlds brought to compliance, but by the manner of their victories, achieved with minimal collateral damage and maximum efficiency. The 28th Expedition Fleet, commanded personally by Fulgrim, became known for its ability to achieve compliance through demonstration rather than devastation. On numerous occasions, Fulgrim would challenge the champion of a resistant human culture to single combat, defeating them with such technical perfection that surrender became the only logical response. This approach spared countless lives and preserved valuable infrastructure that might otherwise have been destroyed in protracted conflicts. Notable among the Emperor's children's campaigns was the cleansing of Laren, a turning point that would later prove catastrophic for the Legion. The Lair were serpentine Xenos of remarkable technological advancement, inhabiting a system that the 28th Expedition Fleet encountered in the later years of the Great Crusade. Imperial tacticians estimated that subduing the Lair would require at least a decade of conventional warfare. Fulgrim, however, declared that the Emperor's children would complete the task in 100 days. The Lair home world presented unique challenges, a largely aquatic planet with habitation zones built on massive coral formations rising from the global ocean. The Xenos defenders utilized highly advanced technology, including personal flight systems and sonic weapons that could shatter ceramite armor. Most concerning to Imperial observers was the Lair's enhanced reaction speed, which nearly matched Astartes' reflexes. Fulgrim approached this campaign with characteristic thoroughness, studying Lair combat patterns and adapting his legion's tactics accordingly. He developed a three-dimensional battle strategy that accounted for the unusual vertical terrain of the coral formations and the Lair's aerial mobility. The Emperor's children executed this plan with precision, securing beachheads on the major coral cities and advancing methodically through the alien structures. The campaign culminated in Fulgrim personally leading an assault on the central Lair Temple city, where he encountered the species champion, a creature of nightmarish speed and strength enhanced by unknown technologies. The duel between Primarch and Xeno's champion has been described in fragmentary battle reports from witnesses. Fulgrim ultimately prevailed, but not before suffering several wounds that would have killed an ordinary Astartes. Within the temple, Fulgrim discovered an ornate sword of extraordinary craftsmanship. The blade appeared to be fashioned from a material that shifted between solid and liquid states, its surface rippling with iridescent patterns that caught and held the eye. Recognizing its superior craftsmanship, Fulgrim claimed this weapon as a trophy of his victory, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences, as the blade was tainted with the psychic essence of a Slaaneshi entity. The cleansing of Laren was completed in exactly 100 days, as Fulgrim had promised. The Emperor's children suffered casualties below Imperial projections, while achieving total xenocide of the Lair species. By conventional metrics, it was a flawless victory. Yet this campaign marked the beginning of subtle changes in Fulgrim and his legion, an increasing obsession with sensory experiences, and a growing dissatisfaction with merely technical perfection. The sword from the Lair Temple, which Fulgrim began carrying in place of the fireblade gifted by Ferrus Manus, exerted a gradual influence on the Primarch's mind. Those closest to him noted changes in his behavior, moments of uncharacteristic irritability, increasing vanity, and a newfound fascination with extreme sensations. These changes were subtle enough to be attributed to the pressures of command rather than external influence. The Emperor's children's obsession with perfection transcended mere military prowess. Unlike other legions who measured success through conquest alone, the Third Legion evaluated every action through the lens of how it was accomplished. A victory achieved through brute force or at great cost was considered no victory at all. This philosophy permeated every aspect of their existence, from battlefield tactics to cultural pursuits, creating warriors who were as comfortable discussing theoretical aesthetics as they were executing flawless battle maneuvers. At the core of the Legion's ethos was the concept of perfect action, the belief that any endeavor, whether martial or artistic, could be refined to its purest expression. Training exercises weren't simply repeated until successful, but continued long after mastery had been achieved, seeking the elusive state where technique transcended conscious thought. Battle brothers would spend hundreds of hours perfecting a single sword stroke or bolter reload sequence, analyzing every minute movement for inefficiencies. This pursuit extended beyond combat skills to include oratory, calligraphy, musical composition, and countless other disciplines considered essential to the complete warrior. The Legion maintained extensive libraries aboard their vessels, containing works of philosophy, tactical treatises, and artistic masterpieces collected from across the expanding Imperium. Study periods were mandatory, with Astartes expected to cultivate knowledge across multiple fields. Battle brothers frequently engaged in philosophical debates between combat deployments, examining concepts of beauty, efficiency, and purpose with the same intensity they brought to war. These discussions weren't viewed as diversions, but as essential components of their development as the Emperor's perfect warriors. This cultural emphasis was formalized through the Legion's distinctive organizational structure. Unlike the rigid hierarchies found in legions like the Ultramarines or Imperial Fists, the Emperor's children employed a more fluid system that allowed exceptional individuals to rise rapidly through the ranks. While conventional command structures existed, overlaid upon them was a complex network of specialized formations that recognized particular talents and achievements. The most renowned of these specialized formations was the Palatine Blades, an elite fellowship of swordsmen who had mastered the art of blade combat to an extraordinary degree. Selection for the Palatine Blades required not only superlative skill, but also a philosophical understanding of swordsmanship as both art and science. Members were identified by distinctive helmets adorned with transverse crests and carried phase blades, rare weapons whose molecular structure could be temporarily altered to pass through conventional armor. In battle, they operated in small units of 3 to 5 warriors, targeting enemy commanders or elite formations with precision strikes that resembled choreographed performances more than combat. The Phoenix Guard represented another specialized formation within the Legion, serving as Fulgrim's personal honor guard. Limited to exactly 200 warriors in reference to the 200 survivors of the Blight, the Phoenix Guard wore ornate cataphracti Terminator armor, adorned with flame motifs and the Imperial Aquila. Selection criteria extended beyond combat prowess to include artistic accomplishment, philosophical acumen, and absolute loyalty to both Primarch and Emperor. Each member was hand-chosen by Fulgrim himself after demonstrating exceptional performance in at least 3 separate disciplines. Their battlefield role focused on bodyguard duties and spearheading critical assaults where failure was not an option. Perhaps most controversial among the Legion's internal organizations were the warrior lodges, which emerged during the later years of the Great Crusade. Initially conceived as informal brotherhoods where Astartes could discuss philosophical matters outside the rigid confines of military hierarchy, the lodges gradually evolved into influential power centers within the Legion. Membership was selective, with elaborate initiation rituals and oaths of secrecy. The lodges provided spaces where battle brothers could speak freely about their pursuit of perfection without the constraints of rank or protocol. While ostensibly focused on self-improvement, these organizations would later become vectors for corruption, as their emphasis on sensory and emotional exploration aligned with Slaaneshi influences. The command structure of the Emperor's Children reflected their meritocratic philosophy, while the Legion maintained the standard organizational divisions of chapters, companies, and squads. Advancement was based on demonstrated excellence rather than seniority. Officers were expected to exemplify the Legion's values through personal conduct and achievement, leading from the front and setting standards through example rather than authority alone. This created a highly competitive internal culture where ambitious Astartes constantly sought opportunities to distinguish themselves. Lord Commander Eidolon exemplified this system, rising from humble origins as a Terran-born Astartes to become Fulgrim's second in command through sheer force of will and accomplishment. Despite lacking the genetic connection of Chemos-born recruits, Eidolon secured his position by consistently exceeding expectations in both combat and cultural pursuits. His rise inspired others within the Legion, reinforcing the belief that perfection was attainable through dedication regardless of one's starting point. The Emperor's Children's combat doctrine emphasized precision, speed, and flawless execution rather than overwhelming force. While other legions might deploy massive artillery barrages or waves of infantry, the Third Legion preferred surgical strikes that neutralized enemy capabilities with minimal collateral damage. Their approach to warfare was cerebral and analytical, treating each engagement as a problem to be solved through perfect application of the appropriate techniques. Strategic planning within the Legion was exhaustive, with commanders spending weeks developing operations that other legions might conceive in days. Every contingency was anticipated, every variable calculated, and every movement choreographed to maximize efficiency. Battle plans often incorporated aesthetic considerations alongside tactical ones, seeking elegance in execution as well as effectiveness. The Legion's perfectionism sometimes frustrated Allied forces unused to such meticulous preparation, but the results spoke for themselves in consistently lower casualty rates and higher mission success probabilities. On the battlefield, the Emperor's Children operated with a fluid coordination that bordered on precognition. Units moved in perfect synchronization, each warrior instinctively understanding his role within the larger formation. Their attacks targeted critical vulnerabilities with surgical precision, command structures, communication nodes, and logistical choke points, often ending conflicts before they fully developed. When forced into prolonged engagements, they maintained discipline that was remarkable even by Astartes standards, executing complex maneuvers under fire without hesitation or error. The Legion specialized in rapid assault tactics, utilizing jump packs, jet bikes, and specialized land speeders to deliver precise strikes against critical targets. The Skyriver jet bike squadrons became particularly renowned, with pilots capable of maneuvers that defied conventional aerodynamics. These elite formations would sweep through enemy formations at incredible speeds, their synchronized movements resembling aerial ballets more than attack runs. Ground forces displayed similar coordination, with tactical squads flowing between cover points in perfectly timed sequences that minimized exposure while maximizing firepower. Their approach to void warfare reflected the same principles, with Legion vessels executing complex maneuvers that conventional naval doctrine deemed impossible. Fleet commanders studied astronomical phenomena to plot gravity-assisted trajectories that allowed their ships to approach targets from unexpected vectors. Boarding actions were conducted with mathematical precision, breach teams timing their assaults to exploit momentary weaknesses in enemy void shields or defensive formations. The Legion's preference for precision over brute force extended to their weapons and equipment. Standard issue bolters were modified for improved accuracy and reduced recoil, sacrificing some stopping power for the ability to place shots with absolute precision. Close combat weapons received similar attention, with power swords balanced to microscopic tolerances and chain weapons tuned to operate at optimal frequencies for different target materials. Even grenades were customized with variable yield settings that allowed for precise application of force appropriate to specific tactical situations. This emphasis on specialized equipment was supported by an extensive corps of Legion artificers who elevated technical maintenance to an art form. These specialists were accorded unusual status within the Legion hierarchy, recognized for their contribution to battlefield excellence. Armor and weapons were not merely maintained, but continuously improved through incremental modifications, each Battle Brother's equipment evolving to complement his individual fighting style. The resulting arsenal was as diverse as it was effective, with no two warriors carrying identical loadouts despite superficial standardization. The recruitment and training processes of the Emperor's children were designed to identify and develop candidates who embodied the Legion's perfectionist ethos. Initial selection criteria were extraordinarily stringent, with aspirants evaluated not only for physical potential, but also intellectual capacity, aesthetic sensitivity, and psychological resilience. On Chemos, this process began with planetary-wide competitions in multiple disciplines, allowing talented youths to distinguish themselves regardless of background. Similar systems were established on other recruiting worlds, creating a diverse pool of exceptional candidates. Those selected underwent a training regimen of unprecedented intensity and scope. Physical conditioning was complemented by education in history, philosophy, literature, and the arts, creating warriors with cultural knowledge rivaling that of planetary nobility. Combat training emphasized understanding the theoretical principles behind techniques rather than mere repetition, with aspirants expected to articulate the biomechanical and psychological foundations of every maneuver they learned. The implantation process for GeneSeed was conducted with extraordinary care, with success rates significantly higher than most other legions. This was partly due to the inherent stability of Fulgrim's genetic template, but also resulted from the meticulous screening of candidates and the exceptional skill of Legion apothecaries. Each stage of the transformation was monitored for optimal development, with individualized protocols adjusted to maximize compatibility with each aspirant's unique physiology. Neophytes who successfully completed their transformation faced additional trials before being accepted as full Battle Brothers. These challenges tested not only combat prowess, but also intellectual development, artistic sensitivity, and psychological balance. A candidate might be required to compose a treatise on void warfare strategy, create a sculpture capturing the essence of the Legion's philosophy, or engage in philosophical debate with established veterans. Only those who demonstrated excellence across multiple domains were permitted to join the ranks of the Emperor's children. Once accepted, new Astartes continued their development through a formalized mentorship system. Each Battle Brother was paired with a veteran who guided his continued growth, providing personalized instruction and critique. These relationships often lasted decades, creating lineages of expertise that preserved and refined specialized knowledge. The most accomplished veterans might maintain several such mentorships simultaneously, creating webs of influence that transcended formal command structures. The Legion's emphasis on perfection extended to battlefield medicine and recovery protocols. Injured warriors were not simply healed, but restored to peak condition through extensive rehabilitation programs. Physical therapy was complemented by cognitive exercises and aesthetic appreciation sessions, treating the mind and spirit as essential components of combat readiness. Those who suffered severe injuries requiring extensive augmetics viewed their reconstruction as an opportunity for improvement rather than mere replacement, working closely with apothecaries and artificers to optimize their new capabilities. This holistic approach to warrior development produced Astartes of remarkable versatility and depth. Emperor's children Battle Brothers could transition seamlessly between roles as circumstances required, their comprehensive training allowing them to adapt to changing battlefield conditions without specialized instruction. A tactical squad sergeant might analyze enemy fortifications with an architect's eye, identifying structural weaknesses invisible to conventional assessment. An assault marine might employ principles of classical dance to enhance his combat movements, achieving efficiency of motion that conventional martial training couldn't provide. The pursuit of perfection that defined the Emperor's children created warriors of extraordinary capability, embodying the Emperor's vision of transhuman potential more completely than perhaps any other legion. Their integration of martial excellence with cultural sophistication represented a unique interpretation of the Astartes' purpose, not merely weapons of conquest, but exemplars of humanity's highest aspirations. This comprehensive approach to perfection would have made them the ideal vanguard for the enlightened imperium the emperor envisioned. The Emperor's Children's first major triumph during the Great Crusade came at the compliance of 14020, a technologically advanced human world whose population had maintained a sophisticated military capacity throughout the Age of Strife. Initial imperial assessment classified the planet as requiring at least 3 years of conventional warfare to achieve compliance. Fulgrim, however, saw an opportunity to demonstrate his legion's growing capabilities. Rather than launching a direct assault, the Emperor's Children deployed infiltration teams to key military installations across 14020's primary continent. These small units, comprising no more than 5 Astartes each, penetrated the planet's defense grid by exploiting minute gaps in sensor coverage that conventional analysis had deemed too narrow for effective insertion. Moving with preternatural stealth, they reached their designated targets simultaneously, neutralizing command centers with such precision that most defenders were unaware of the attack until it had already succeeded. The operation culminated with Fulgrim himself leading a strike against the planetary governor's fortress palace. Accompanied by 30 warriors of the Phoenix Guard, the Primarch bypassed the outer defenses entirely by utilizing an ancient maintenance tunnel that geological surveys had identified beneath the structure. The strike force emerged directly into the central command chamber during a meeting of the Planetary Defense Council. Contemporary accounts describe the defenders' shock as the purple-armored giants materialized in their midst, weapons already in motion. Within 7 minutes, the entire planetary leadership had been captured without a single fatality. This bloodless decapitation strike led to the prompt surrender of 14020's military forces. More impressively, Fulgrim's subsequent diplomatic handling of the transition to imperial rule won genuine allegiance from the population. He recognized the cultural and technological achievements of 14020, incorporating their best elements into the compliance process rather than imposing a standardized imperial template. This approach became a hallmark of Emperor's Children conquests, precision warfare followed by nuanced cultural integration. The compliance of Baiz's 4 years later demonstrated the Legion's evolution into a more comprehensive fighting force. This campaign required a different approach, as the Byzant cluster consisted of 7 heavily fortified worlds whose ruling technocracy rejected imperial authority outright. Here, the Emperor's Children deployed their full arsenal of tactical innovations, including the first battlefield use of their specialized Skyriver jetbike formations. The Baiz's campaign opened with a void battle that showcased the Legion's naval prowess. Captain Saul Tarvitz, commanding the strike cruiser Andronius, developed a revolutionary approach to void warfare that exploited the gravitational relationship between the system's binary stars. By calculating precise trajectories through the fluctuating gravity wells, Tarvitz created attack vectors that conventional defense algorithms couldn't predict. This allowed the numerically inferior Emperor's Children fleet to engage and neutralize Byzant vessels individually rather than facing their combined firepower. Once orbital supremacy was established, the ground war began with simultaneous landings on 3 of the 7 worlds. On Baiz's prime, Lord Commander Eidolon employed the Trident formation, a tactical innovation that divided his forces into 3 specialized battle groups. The first group, designated Spear, consisted of assault units equipped with jump packs and melta weapons, tasked with breaching the massive fortress cities that dominated the landscape. The second, Shield, comprised tactical squads with enhanced defensive capabilities who would secure and hold breached areas. The third, Blade, was composed of Palatine blades and other elite close combat specialists who would exploit openings to strike at command nodes. This tripartite approach allowed Eidolon's forces to maintain constant pressure on multiple fronts while adapting to changing battlefield conditions. When the defenders of Helios Citadel concentrated their forces to repel the Spear Group's frontal assault, shield units were rapidly redeployed to support the unexpectedly successful blade penetration of the southern quadrant. This flexibility confounded the Byzant commanders, whose defensive doctrine relied on predictable attack patterns. On Byzas Secundus, Captain Lucius introduced another tactical innovation that would later be adopted by other legions: the echoing advance. This technique involved small units making rapid, high-visibility attacks against multiple targets in sequence, creating the impression of a much larger force. Defenders would respond by reinforcing areas that appeared threatened, only to find the Emperor's children had already moved to new targets. This approach exploited the psychological impact of the Astartes' appearance, using fear as a force multiplier to divert enemy resources inefficiently. The most significant battle of the campaign occurred on Byzas Tertius, where Fulgrim personally led an assault against the Techno-Arcology, a massive structure housing both the planet's leadership and its primary manufacturing capacity. The conventional approach would have required a protracted siege against the Arcology's formidable void shields and automated defense systems. Instead, Fulgrim employed a stratagem of unprecedented audacity. Utilizing intelligence gathered by Legion reconnaissance units, the Primarch identified a critical vulnerability. The Arcology's primary plasma reactors required external cooling systems that couldn't be fully protected by the void shields without causing dangerous harmonic resonances. Fulgrim led a small force of 50 Astartes, including the entire Palatine Blade Fellowship, in a precision drop pod insertion directly onto these cooling arrays. The defenders had considered this approach suicidal due to the extreme radiation and temperature conditions surrounding the systems. The Emperor's children had prepared for these environmental challenges by modifying their armor with specialized radiation shielding and thermal regulators developed by Legion artificers. These modifications allowed them to operate in conditions that would have incapacitated conventional forces, achieving complete surprise. Once the cooling systems were compromised, the Arcology's administrators faced an impossible choice between lowering their void shields or risking a catastrophic reactor failure. Their surrender came within hours, bringing the entire campaign to a conclusion in just over 3 months, less than a quarter of the time projected by Imperial strategists. The Emperor's children's battlefield innovations extended beyond tactical formations to include specialized equipment modifications and combat techniques. Their tactical squads developed the Cascade Fire Bolter discipline, where squad members would time their shots in precisely staggered sequences to overwhelm enemy cover positions. Rather than the simultaneous volley fire favored by legions like the Ultramarines, this approach created continuous pressure that prevented defenders from timing their return fire during reloading phases. In close combat, the Legion pioneered techniques that treated melee as a form of psychological warfare. The Palatine Blades, in particular, developed a fighting style called the Spiral Path, which incorporated deliberate flourishes and artistic movements alongside lethal strikes. These seemingly superfluous elements served a practical purpose, disorienting opponents and creating split-second openings for killing blows. Against human opponents, this approach proved especially effective, as the psychological impact of facing warriors who appeared to be performing rather than merely fighting often induced paralysis or panic. The Emperor's children maintained particularly close military alliances with the Iron Hands and Luna Wolves throughout the Great Crusade, developing complementary tactics that maximized their respective strengths. With Ferrus Manus's legion, they perfected the hammer and blade approach, Iron Hands providing overwhelming force against enemy strong points, while Emperor's children's strike teams exploited the resulting breaches with lightning precision. This partnership reached its zenith during the Gardenal campaign, where the combined legions achieved compliance of a heavily fortified system in 1/3 the projected timeframe. The alliance with Horus Lupercal's Luna Wolves created a different dynamic, focused on leadership decapitation and psychological warfare. During joint operations, Luna Wolves would typically execute their trademark spear dip thrust into enemy formations, creating chaos and drawing defensive resources inward. Emperor's children would exploit this distraction to execute precision strikes against secondary command structures, communication networks, and supply lines. This approach proved devastatingly effective against the Orc Empire of Ulanor, where Emperor's Children units systematically eliminated the Greenskin Society's nascent technological infrastructure, while the Luna Wolves engaged their primary fighting forces. These military partnerships were reinforced through cultural exchanges between the legions. Emperor's Children and Iron Hands Astartes frequently participated in weapon crafting competitions, pushing the boundaries of conventional arms design. The resulting innovations included the phase blade technology later, adopted by the Palatine blades, and the Volkite Serpenta configurations favored by Iron Hands Terminator units. Similarly, Emperor's Children and Luna Wolves officers established a tradition of tactical symposiums where battle plans were analyzed and refined, creating a shared repository of strategic knowledge that benefited both legions. The Emperor's Children fleet evolved into one of the most distinctive among the legions, emphasizing speed and precision over raw firepower. At its center was Fulgrim's flagship, the Pride of the Emperor, a vessel unlike any other in the Imperium's arsenal. Originally constructed as a standard Gloriana-class battleship, the Pride underwent extensive modifications under Fulgrim's direction. Its propulsion systems were reconfigured for enhanced maneuverability, sacrificing some armor protection for superior acceleration and turning capacity. The weapon systems similarly emphasized precision, with lance batteries capable of pinpoint strikes against specific systems on enemy vessels, rather than the area effect bombardments favored by other Legion flagships. Most distinctive were the Pride's internal spaces, which reflected the Emperor's Children's cultural ethos. The traditional austere chambers of an Astartes vessel were replaced with galleries displaying artwork from across the Imperium, acoustic halls designed for musical performances, and debate forums where philosophical discussions were conducted between deployments. The ship's bridge incorporated elements of theatrical design, with tiered command platforms and lighting systems that emphasized the Primarch's presence during fleet operations. Supporting the Pride were 17 battle barges, each named after virtues the Legion aspired to embody: perfection, dignity, pride, magnificence, and similar concepts. These vessels maintained more conventional military configurations, but incorporated elements of the flagship's design philosophy, particularly in propulsion and targeting systems. The battle barge Andronicus became particularly renowned after Captain Tarvitz used it to execute the Falling Star maneuver during the Void Battle of Byzas, diving through an enemy formation at maximum thrust with void shields deliberately collapsed, only to reinitialize all systems simultaneously while inside their defensive envelope. The Legion's escort vessels reflected their tactical preference for precision strikes. Rather than the standard mix of destroyers and frigates, the Emperor's Children fleet incorporated an unusually high proportion of fast attack vessels designated Acuity-class light cruisers. These ships, smaller than traditional cruisers but more heavily armed than frigates, excelled at flanking maneuvers and exploitation of breakthroughs. They typically operated in squadrons of 3, using synchronized attack patterns to overwhelm individual targets before rapidly disengaging. This naval doctrine complemented the Legion's ground operations, allowing for precise insertion of forces at critical junctures. During the compliance of Prandium, the Emperor's Children fleet demonstrated this capability by executing simultaneous landings at 17 separate locations across the planet's surface, each targeting a specific node in the Defender's command structure. The resulting confusion prevented any coordinated response, allowing the Legion to secure compliance with minimal casualties on either side. The Emperor's Children's approach to warfare during the Great Crusade represented a unique interpretation of the Imperial Truth's principles. Where other legions might measure success through territories conquered or enemies slain, the Third Legion evaluated their achievements against an internal standard of perfection. This philosophy produced victories that were not merely effective, but exemplary, demonstrations of how compliance could be achieved through precision rather than devastation, and how conquered populations could be integrated rather than merely subjugated. This methodology reached its apex during the middle years of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's Children achieved what many imperial historians consider their finest hour: the liberation of Laren. The compliance of this Xenos held system had been projected to require years of conventional warfare, yet Fulgrim's legion completed it in exactly 100 days through a series of perfectly executed operations. The campaign demonstrated every aspect of the Emperor's Children's martial philosophy: precise void maneuvers, synchronized ground assaults, and targeted decapitation strikes, culminating in Fulgrim's personal elimination of the Lair leadership caste. The cleansing of Laren marked not only the Emperor's Children's greatest military triumph, but also the beginning of their tragic fall. What appeared to be a flawless victory concealed the seeds of corruption that would ultimately transform the Legion from exemplars of perfection into devotees of excess. The campaign against the serpentine Xenos of the Laren system was undertaken with the Emperor's Children's characteristic precision and thoroughness, but the nature of their enemy harbored dangers beyond conventional warfare. The Lair were a highly advanced species whose entire civilization had been built upon the worship of sensory experience. Their technology, culture, and even physiology revolved around the pursuit of heightened sensation. Initial Imperial reconnaissance had identified them as a significant threat requiring extensive military action, but Fulgrim, ever confident in his Legion's capabilities, declared they would achieve compliance within 100 days. The Legion's assault began with a series of synchronized strikes against the Lair's orbital defenses. These Xenos structures demonstrated biological and mechanical hybridization, unlike anything previously encountered in the Crusade. The Lair vessels moved with unnatural fluidity, their hulls rippling and reforming in response to damage. Despite these advantages, the Emperor's Children fleet executed a perfect encirclement maneuver, isolating and eliminating the alien craft through precision lance strikes to their propulsion nodes. With void superiority established, the Legion commenced planetary operations against the Lair homeworld, a mostly aquatic planet dotted with massive coral formations that served as the aliens' primary habitation centers. These structures rose thousands of meters from the global ocean, connected by a network of transport tubes that allowed the serpentine Xenos to move between their cities with remarkable efficiency. Lord Commander Eidolon led the initial assault against the outlying formations, employing drop pod insertions followed by jet bike strikes to secure beachheads. The Lair defenders responded with unexpected ferocity, utilizing advanced sonic weapons that could shatter ceramite armor at close range. More disturbing were the physical capabilities of the Xenos themselves. Their serpentine bodies moved with preternatural speed, and many displayed biological modifications that enhanced their combat effectiveness. Some Lair warriors had multiple arms grafted to their torsos, while others possessed glands that secreted neurotoxins capable of penetrating Astartes' armor seals. Despite these challenges, the Emperor's Children advanced methodically through the coral cities, adapting their tactics to counter each new Xenos capability they encountered. Apothecary Fabius, already known for his medical expertise, developed field treatments for the Lair toxins, allowing wounded Astartes to return to combat within hours rather than days. Captain Saul Tarvitz's tactical squads perfected new firing patterns that neutralized the Lair's speed advantage, creating overlapping fields of bolter fire that forced the Serpentine warriors into predictable evasion patterns. As the campaign progressed, the Legion encountered increasing evidence of the Lair's cultural degeneracy. Their cities contained chambers dedicated to sensory stimulation, where Xenos would gather to experience drug-induced hallucinations or engage in bizarre rituals that melded pleasure and pain. Most Astartes regarded these discoveries with appropriate disgust, but reports from this period note the first instances of Emperor's Children warriors displaying unusual curiosity about these practices. Several squads were reprimanded for spending excessive time examining Lair artifacts rather than proceeding with their assigned objectives. The campaign culminated with an assault on the central Lair Temple City, a massive coral structure that rose higher than any other formation on the planet. Intelligence indicated this location served as both the species' primary religious center and the seat of their leadership caste. Fulgrim himself led this attack, accompanied by his Phoenix Guard and the elite First Company under Captain Julius Kisoran. The temple's exterior defenses proved formidable, with crystalline towers that channeled energy between them, creating barriers that repelled conventional weapons. The Emperor's children overcame these through a combination of melta charges placed at precise structural weak points and the deployment of specially modified land raiders, whose accelerated engines allowed them to breach the energy fields before they could fully coalesce. Once inside the temple complex, the Legion encountered the most heavily modified lair yet seen, warriors whose bodies had been so extensively altered they barely resembled their original form. These temple guardians fought with religious fervor, many continuing to attack even after suffering wounds that should have been immediately fatal. The fighting through the temple's labyrinthine corridors was brutal and close-quartered, with the Emperor's children forced to abandon their preferred precision tactics for a more direct approach. At the temple's heart, Fulgrim discovered a massive chamber dominated by a swirling, iridescent pool that seemed to defy the normal properties of liquid. The surface rippled with patterns that caught and held the eye, creating optical illusions that several Astartes later reported as inducing momentary hallucinations. Surrounding this pool were the highest members of the lair priesthood, their bodies modified to the point of grotesquerie, with sensory organs multiplied and enhanced beyond any practical function. The battle within this central chamber was brief but intense. The lair high priests utilized psychic abilities not previously displayed by their species, assaulting the Emperor's children with both conventional weapons and direct mental attacks. Several Astartes fell to these psychic assaults, their minds overwhelmed by sensory information too intense to process. Fulgrim himself was targeted by the lead priest, a creature whose body had been reshaped into a weapon of war while still retaining the capacity for sophisticated psychic attack. The duel between Primarch and Xeno's priest has been reconstructed from fragmented battle reports. Fulgrim's natural resistance to psychic influence allowed him to withstand the mental assaults, while his superior physical abilities eventually overcame the priest's biological enhancements. With the death of their religious leader, the remaining lair resistance collapsed, allowing the Emperor's children to secure the temple and, by extension, complete their conquest of the planet. It was in the aftermath of this final battle that Fulgrim discovered the artifact that would prove his undoing, a sword of extraordinary craftsmanship displayed prominently on an altar near the iridescent pool. The weapon's blade appeared to shift between solid and liquid states, its surface rippling with patterns similar to those observed in the mysterious pool. The hilt was wrapped in what appeared to be leather, but was later determined to be processed lair skin, embedded with crystalline structures that resonated when touched. Recognizing the superior craftsmanship of the weapon, Fulgrim claimed it as a trophy of his victory. This decision, made in a moment of aesthetic appreciation, would have catastrophic consequences. Unknown to the Primarch, the sword contained the essence of a Slaaneshi demon, trapped within the blade through arcane processes during the lair's religious rituals. While not immediately possessed, Fulgrim's contact with the weapon established a connection that would allow the entity to gradually influence his thoughts and perceptions. The cleansing of Laren was completed in exactly 100 days, as Fulgrim had promised. The Emperor's children departed the system having achieved total xenocide of the lair species, a victory that reinforced their reputation for flawless execution. Yet they carried with them more than trophies and battle honors. The subtle corruption of Slaanesh had taken root in the Legion, particularly in its Primarch, who now bore the demon-infused blade at his side. The first signs of change appeared during the journey from the Laren system. Fulgrim, normally disciplined in his habits, began spending extended periods in his private chambers aboard the Pride of the Emperor. When he emerged, staff officers noted subtle alterations in his demeanor, increased irritability when his orders weren't executed perfectly, and a new tendency to punish perceived failures with unusual severity. These behaviors, while concerning, were attributed to the stresses of command rather than external influence. More significant were the cultural changes that began to manifest throughout the Legion. The pursuit of perfection, always central to the Emperor's children's ethos, took on new dimensions. Where previously they had sought the perfect balance of efficiency and elegance, they now began exploring the perfect experience of sensation. Battle brothers who had once debated the optimal angle for a sword thrust now discussed the precise feeling of the blade penetrating different types of armor, or the exact sound made by various xenospecies when struck by specific weapons. This shift was particularly evident in the Legion's relationship with the Remembrancer Order, a group of artists, historians, and documentarians attached to the Great Crusade fleets by Malcador the Sigillite. These civilians were tasked with recording the achievements of the Astartes for posterity, creating a cultural legacy to match their military accomplishments. While most legions tolerated the Remembrancers with varying degrees of reluctance, the Emperor's children had initially embraced them, seeing value in having their perfection immortalized through art. Following Laren, this relationship intensified and twisted. Fulgrim began spending considerable time with selected Remembrancers, particularly those whose work explored sensory experiences. He developed a special interest in three artists whose approaches resonated with his evolving aesthetic: the sculptor Ostjan de Laffer, the painter Serena d'Angelis, and the composer Bekwakinska. Ostjan de Laffer was perhaps the most conventional of the three, a sculptor of remarkable talent whose work captured the physical perfection of the Astartes with uncanny accuracy. His masterpiece, a marble rendering of Fulgrim that took nearly a year to complete, demonstrated not only technical skill, but a deep understanding of the Primarch's essence. The statue depicted Fulgrim in a moment of contemplation rather than triumph, suggesting depths beyond the warrior aspect that most artists emphasized. Fulgrim was initially pleased with this representation, but following Laren, he began criticizing the work for its stillness, claiming it failed to capture the dynamic nature of true perfection. Serena d'Angelis approached her art from a more visceral perspective. Her paintings utilized unconventional materials, including her own blood, to create works that evoked emotional responses rather than merely representing physical forms. After exposure to artifacts recovered from Laren, her style underwent a dramatic transformation. Her new works featured disturbing anatomical distortions and color combinations that triggered uncomfortable psychological reactions in viewers. Despite, or perhaps because of, these disturbing elements, Fulgrim began commissioning her to create pieces for his personal quarters and public spaces aboard the Pride of the Emperor. Most significant was Bekwakinska, a composer whose experimental approach to music had already generated controversy before her assignment to the 28th Expedition Fleet. Kinska was fascinated by the sonic weapons employed by the lair, convincing Fulgrim to allow her access to captured examples for study. She claimed these devices operated on principles that transcended conventional understanding of sound, producing frequencies that affected the listener on a neurological level rather than merely through auditory perception. The result of Kinska's research was her magnum opus, a symphonic work she titled Meraviglia. The composition incorporated elements derived from her analysis of lair technology, including tonal patterns and harmonic structures impossible to create with conventional instruments. To perform this work, she designed new instruments that utilized principles reverse-engineered from the Xenos sonic weapons, capable of producing sounds beyond the normal range of human hearing, but which nevertheless affected the nervous system directly. Fulgrim authorized the construction of a concert hall aboard the Pride of the Emperor, specifically for the premiere of Meraviglia. The venue was designed with acoustic properties that would enhance the unique qualities of Kinska's composition, utilizing materials salvaged from the Lair Temple that possessed unusual resonant characteristics. The hall's completion coincided with the fleet's arrival at Istvan III, where the Emperor's children would participate in what was ostensibly a compliance action against a rebellious human world. The performance of the Meraviglia marked the point of no return for the Emperor's children. Attended by the Legion's senior officers, selected battle brothers, and the elite of the Remembrancer Order, the concert began conventionally enough. Kinska conducted an orchestra comprising both human musicians and servitor constructs designed to play her new instruments, opening with familiar harmonic progressions that gradually shifted into the alien patterns derived from Lair technology. As the performance progressed, witnesses reported experiencing synesthetic effects, seeing sounds as colors, tasting harmonies, feeling rhythms as physical sensations across their skin. These experiences intensified until the music reached a crescendo that triggered a catastrophic psychic event. The warp-infused frequencies opened a temporary rift between real space and the immaterium, allowing Slaaneshi entities to manifest within the concert hall. The entities that emerged were demonettes, lesser servants of the pleasure god, whose presence accelerated and crystallized the corruption that had been gradually spreading through the Legion since Laren. Many of the human attendees were immediately possessed or driven insane by the manifestation, while the Astartes present experienced the event differently. For them, the performance stripped away the discipline and restraint that had channeled their pursuit of perfection, replacing it with an unquenchable thirst for sensation in all its forms. The aftermath of the Meraviglia was a bloodbath. The possessed remembrancers turned on those who had not been claimed by the entities, while the affected Astartes joined in the slaughter, experiencing the act of killing as an art form rather than a military necessity. Those who survived described scenes of unimaginable depravity, with officers who had once embodied the Legion's highest ideals now engaged in acts that defiled both their victims and themselves. Fulgrim, present for the performance, experienced the most profound transformation. The demon within his sword, which had been subtly influencing him since Laren, used the psychic disruption created by the Meraviglia to strengthen its hold. While not yet achieving full possession, the entity gained significantly greater control over the Primarch's perceptions and emotions. Fulgrim emerged from the concert hall with his outward appearance unchanged, but his inner nature fundamentally altered. The pursuit of perfection remained his driving motivation, but his understanding of what constituted perfection had been irrevocably twisted. The events aboard the Pride of the Emperor coincided with the final stages of Horus's planning for his rebellion against the Imperium. The War Master, already aware of Fulgrim's growing susceptibility to corruption, moved quickly to secure the Emperor's children's allegiance to his cause. He arranged a private meeting with Fulgrim where he revealed his intentions and the powers that now supported him. The corrupted Primarch, his judgment compromised by the demon's influence, saw in Horus's rebellion not treachery but opportunity, a chance to pursue perfection without the restraints imposed by imperial doctrine. The orbital approach to Istvan V presented a deceptively peaceful tableau. The verdant death world rotated serenely beneath the assembled armada of 7 legions, the largest concentration of Astartes vessels since the triumph at Ulanor. The Emperor's Children fleet, now bearing the scars of the recent virus bombing of Istvan III, took position alongside the other traitor legions, Sons of Horus, World Eaters, and Death Guard. In high anchor above them waited the supposed loyalist reinforcements, Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, Night Lords, and Word-Bearers, all secretly pledged to Horus's rebellion. At 600 ship time, Fulgrim summoned his senior officers to the stratageum aboard the Pride of the Emperor. The Primarch's appearance had subtly changed since the performance of the Meraviglia. His once pristine armor now bore elaborate engravings that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. His silver-white hair hung loose around shoulders, draped with a cloak of iridescent scaled hide harvested from the Lair Temple city. Most striking was the sword at his hip, the demon weapon from Laren, its surface rippling like liquid metal. Lord Commander Eidolon stood at Fulgrim's right hand, his armor modified with sonic amplifiers reverse-engineered from Lair technology. Captain Julius Kisoron of the First Company positioned himself nearby, fingers constantly tracing the edge of his combat blade. Chief Apothecary Fabius, recently elevated to Fulgrim's inner circle, occupied a place of honor, his Narthesium gauntlet stained with substances no Imperial medici would recognize. Conspicuously absent was Captain Saul Tarvitz, who had broken from the Legion to warn the Loyalists on Istvan III of the coming betrayal. Fulgrim outlined the plan for what would become known as the Drop Site Massacre. The Emperor's Children would deploy alongside the Death Guard on the eastern flank of the landing zone, with World Eaters and Sons of Horus taking the center and western approaches. Their target, the Loyalist forces that had survived the virus bombing of Istvan III and escaped to the 5th planet of the system. These included elements of their own legions who had rejected the War Master's rebellion, along with substantial forces from the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands legions, who had responded to Horus's treachery. The first wave of drop pods struck Istvan V's surface at 7:30. The Emperor's Children deployment was executed with their characteristic precision, despite the corruption that had taken root in the Legion. 8,000 Astartes in purple and gold established a beachhead along the black sand shores of the Urgal Depression, a massive impact crater that dominated the northern continent. Their formation was a perfect crescent, each company positioned to maximize firing lanes while maintaining tactical flexibility. Across the depression, the Loyalist forces established defensive positions among the volcanic rock formations. The Iron Hands formed the center of their line, with Salamanders and Raven Guard anchoring the flanks. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands and once Fulgrim's closest brother, directed the defense personally, his silver hands gleaming in the pale sunlight as he issued commands. The initial engagement began at 7:45 with a rolling artillery barrage from Emperor's Children whirlwind batteries, targeting the forward Iron Hands positions. The shells contained not only conventional explosives, but also chemical compounds developed by Fabius that induced sensory disorientation and heightened pain responses. As the barrage lifted, the first wave of Emperor's Children assault units advanced, jump packs propelling them across the volcanic terrain in graceful arcs that belied their lethal purpose. Captain Lucius led the vanguard, his swordsmanship transformed since the Meraviglia into something beyond technical perfection. Each strike was calculated not merely to kill, but to extract maximum sensation from both victim and executioner. His dueling form had become a grotesque parody of the Legion's former martial artistry, emphasizing prolonged combat over efficient execution. Behind him came squads of assault marines, whose chainswords had been modified with oscillating teeth that generated harmonic patterns as they tore through ceramite and flesh. The Loyalist Iron Hands met this assault with disciplined bolter fire, their methodical volleys dropping dozens of Emperor's Children from the air. Those who reached the Iron Hands lines engaged in brutal close combat, the clash of blades echoing across the depression. The fighting was intensely personal, brother legions who had fought alongside each other for decades now locked in mortal combat, each knowing the other's tactics and capabilities intimately. At 8:30, Fulgrim himself entered the battle, leading his Phoenix Guard in a direct thrust toward the Iron Hands command position. The Primarch moved with unnatural grace, his demon sword leaving iridescent trails in the air as it claimed the lives of Loyalist Astartes. Those who witnessed his advance reported that reality seemed to distort around him, colors becoming more vivid and sounds taking on almost physical presence. Some Loyalists froze momentarily upon seeing their former ally transformed, hesitation that invariably proved fatal. Ferrus Manus recognized the threat posed by his brother's advance. Disengaging from a squad of World Eaters, the Gorgon moved to intercept Fulgrim, the legendary hammer forgebreaker gripped in his living metal hands. This weapon, once crafted by Fulgrim as a gift symbolizing their brotherhood, had been given to Horus after Fulgrim's corruption and then passed to Ferrus as a calculated insult. The two Primarchs met on a ridge of black glass, their respective honor guards forming a perimeter around them. What followed was not the honorable duel of brother warriors, but something altogether more sinister. Fulgrim's combat style had transformed from the precise, efficient form he had once perfected into something hypnotic and predatory. He moved not to conclude the fight quickly, but to prolong it, each exchange of blows designed to heighten the emotional and sensory impact. Ferrus fought with characteristic directness, each strike of Forgebreaker intended to end the confrontation decisively. The hammer's head glowed white-hot from the Gorgon's fury, leaving trails of molten glass where it struck the ground after missing its target. For nearly 20 minutes the Primarchs fought while the battle raged around them, neither gaining decisive advantage. The tide turned when Fulgrim executed a move impossible for even a Primarch's physiology, his spine contorting at an unnatural angle to avoid a killing blow from Forgebreaker. This impossible evasion placed him inside Ferrus's guard, where the demon sword found its mark, slicing through the Gorgon's neck with a sound like singing crystal. The head of Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, fell to the obsidian sand as his body collapsed to its knees. Fulgrim claimed this grisly trophy, holding it aloft for both armies to witness. The psychological impact was devastating. The Iron Hands, seeing their father fallen, broke formation and charged the Emperor's children lines in disorganized fury. This emotional reaction played directly into the traitors' strategy, allowing them to isolate and destroy loyalist units piecemeal rather than facing their combined strength. As the first phase of the battle reached its climax at approximately 1,000 hours, the second wave of drop pods breached Istvan's atmosphere. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word Bearers, and Alpha Legion were ostensibly arriving to reinforce the Loyalists. Salamander's Primarch Vulcan ordered his forces to fall back toward these reinforcements, expecting to consolidate their position for a counterattack. Corax of the Raven Guard likewise repositioned his warriors to link up with the arriving legions. The betrayal, when it came, was executed with cold precision. As the Loyalist forces fell back toward their supposed reinforcements, the four newly arrived legions opened fire on their rear positions. Caught between the original traitor forces advancing from the front and this second wave of betrayers, the Loyalists found themselves in a killing ground with no viable escape routes. The Emperor's children exploited this confusion with characteristic tactical acumen. Lord Commander Eidolon directed his companies to focus on Salamander's units attempting to establish defensive positions among the volcanic formations at the eastern edge of the depression. The Legion's newly modified sonic weapons proved particularly effective in these enclosed spaces, the harmonically enhanced frequencies liquefying internal organs while leaving armor intact. Captain Kisoron led the first company in systematic elimination of Raven Guard infiltration teams attempting to outflank the traitor positions. His warriors had developed an uncanny ability to sense the presence of their concealed enemies, a heightened awareness that went beyond conventional Astartes' capabilities. Some battle brothers appeared to track the Raven Guard through scent alone, pursuing them through the labyrinthine rock formations with predatory intensity. By midday, the massacre was fully underway. The Emperor's children no longer operated with their former disciplined efficiency, but displayed a disturbing creativity in their methods of killing. Squad leaders competed to devise the most elaborate executions, sometimes taking prisoners specifically to experiment with novel methods of death. Apothecary Fabius moved across the battlefield collecting genetic samples from fallen loyalists, particularly focusing on retrieving gene seed with unique traits or mutations. Not all Emperor's children participated equally in these excesses. A small contingent led by ancient Rylaner, the Legion's venerable dreadnought, maintained formation discipline and conventional combat protocols. These warriors, mostly Terran-born veterans from before Fulgrim's discovery, executed their battlefield objectives with grim efficiency rather than sadistic enthusiasm. Their restraint was noted by Legion Command, marking them for special attention after the battle concluded. The Loyalists fought with desperate valor against impossible odds. Iron Hands Morlocks formed immovable bulwarks around which other survivors gathered, their Terminator armor withstanding concentrated fire that would have annihilated conventional Astartes. Salamander's fire drakes deployed in wedge formations, their flamers creating corridors of promethium, inferno through which smaller units could attempt breakouts. Raven Guard shadow captains utilized their jump packs for rapid extraction of wounded comrades, sacrificing themselves to ensure others might escape. These heroic efforts could not overcome the overwhelming numerical advantage and strategic position of the traitor forces. By 1500 hours, organized resistance had collapsed into isolated pockets fighting for survival rather than victory. The Emperor's children shifted their focus from combat to collection, securing prisoners for Fabius's experiments and gathering trophies from fallen champions. Fulgrim directed the final phase of the battle from a command position on the eastern ridge, the severed head of Ferrus Manus displayed prominently beside him. Through magnoculars, he observed the systematic elimination of loyalist holdouts with detached appreciation, occasionally sending specific instructions to field commanders regarding particular targets of interest. When Vulcan was reported cornered by word-bearers' units, Fulgrim dispatched his Phoenix Guard to ensure the Salamander's Primarch was captured alive rather than killed. By nightfall, the drop site massacre had concluded. Of the 3 loyalist legions trapped on Istvan V, only scattered elements of the Raven Guard escaped, using their infiltration expertise to slip through the closing net of traitor forces. The Iron Hands suffered near total annihilation, with barely a company's worth of warriors surviving to retreat. The Salamanders fared marginally better, with perhaps 2,000 escaping the killing ground. The Emperor's children claimed extensive trophies from the battlefield. Beyond Ferris's head, they collected weapons, armor components, and gene seed from fallen heroes of all 3 loyalist legions. Particularly prized were the unique flame weapons of Salamander's veterans and the specialized infiltration equipment of Raven Guard shadow captains. These would be modified and incorporated into the legion's arsenal, often with grotesque enhancements designed by Fabius. In the aftermath, the Emperor's children conducted ceremonies that bore little resemblance to traditional victory celebrations. In camps established around the Urgal Depression, they engaged in practices that would have been unimaginable months earlier. The demon sword's influence, amplified by the Meraviglia and now strengthened by the psychic impact of such massive bloodshed, accelerated their transformation from the Emperor's finest to something altogether different. Fulgrim retired to his personal pavilion with the severed head of his former brother, engaging in one-sided conversations with the grisly trophy. Those who guarded the perimeter reported hearing both voices from within, though only the Primarch was present. Unknown to most, this marked the final stage of the demon's possession. Fulgrim's resistance, weakened by the emotional trauma of killing his closest brother, finally collapsed completely. The entity within the sword transferred fully into the Primarch's body, trapping Fulgrim's consciousness as a helpless observer within his own form. When Fulgrim emerged the following morning, those closest to him noticed subtle differences in his demeanor and speech patterns, but attributed these changes to the psychological impact of the previous day's events. The possessed Primarch gathered his senior officers and announced their next destination. They would rendezvous with Perturabo's Iron Warriors at the Shield Worlds to pursue an objective of transcendent importance to their new cause. As the Emperor's children fleet broke orbit from Istvan V, they left behind a world transformed by bloodshed. The black sands of the Urgal Depression had been transmuted by alchemical compounds in their weapons and the psychic resonance of such massive death. Expedition teams sent to the surface years later would report bizarre phenomena, glass formations that screamed when touched, pools of liquid that induced hallucinations in those who approached, and temporal anomalies where echoes of the battle could still be witnessed playing out in ghostly form. The legion that departed Istvan bore little resemblance to the perfection-seeking warriors who had once proudly carried the Emperor's Aquila. Their armor, once maintained to immaculate standards, now featured disturbing modifications, screaming faces worked into pauldrons, sensory enhancement devices grafted directly to helmets, and weapon systems designed to maximize suffering rather than combat efficiency. Their vessels underwent similar transformations, with crew quarters converted to pleasure chambers and command decks redesigned to amplify sensory experiences for the officers. Following the bloodshed of Istvan V, the Emperor's children accelerated their transformation from perfection-seeking warriors into devotees of sensation and excess. The journey from the Istvan system marked the beginning of a profound metamorphosis that would render the Third Legion almost unrecognizable to those who had known them during the Great Crusade's glory days. Aboard the Pride of the Emperor, now rechristened the Prideful Grandiosity in a display of linguistic excess, Fulgrim established new protocols that emphasized sensory exploration over military discipline. The possessed Primarch ordered the ship's environmental systems recalibrated to produce constantly shifting atmospheric conditions, subtle variations in temperature, humidity, and even gravity that kept the Legion's warriors in a perpetual state of sensory awareness. Corridors were infused with psychoactive compounds that induced mild hallucinations, enhancing colors and sounds to preternatural intensity. The former Stratageum, once a model of efficient design, underwent extensive remodeling. Battle maps and tactical displays were replaced with sensory amplification devices. Officers no longer gathered to discuss military objectives, but to experience new sensations curated by specialists who had once been the Legion's finest tacticians. Lord Commander Eidolon presided over these gatherings, his armor modified with sound projection systems that could induce pleasure or pain with precisely modulated frequencies. Throughout the fleet, similar transformations occurred. Training decks were converted into experimental chambers where Astartes tested the limits of their enhanced physiologies. Pain thresholds were systematically explored, with battle brothers competing to endure increasingly extreme stimuli. These exercises were justified as preparation for combat, but the distinction between training and indulgence quickly blurred beyond recognition. The physical changes in the Legion's warriors became increasingly pronounced. What began as minor modifications to enhance sensory input evolved into radical alterations of Astartes' physiology. Chief Apothecary Fabius, now styling himself as Bile in rejection of traditional medici nomenclature, established surgical theaters throughout the fleet where battle brothers underwent voluntary modifications. These transformations followed no standardized pattern, instead reflecting individual obsessions with specific sensory domains. Warriors who fixated on auditory experiences had their auditory cortices enhanced and additional sound reception organs implanted in their armor. Those drawn to tactile sensations received neural augmentations that increased the sensitivity of their skin, sometimes having their armor interfaces modified to transmit rather than block external stimuli. Most disturbing were the modifications focused on pain reception. Conventional Astartes physiology included pain suppression systems that allowed them to function despite serious injuries. Under Bile's scalpel, these systems were not removed but rewired, transforming pain from a warning mechanism into a source of stimulation. Warriors with these modifications reported experiencing combat with unprecedented intensity, each wound received or inflicted generating sensory feedback that bordered on addictive. The Legion's weapons and equipment underwent parallel evolution. The elegant, precisely crafted bolters that had once been maintained to immaculate standards were modified with sensory feedback mechanisms that allowed their wielders to feel the impact of each round through direct neural connection. Close combat weapons received similar treatment, with power field generators tuned to transmit tactile sensations while still delivering lethal energy. Most significant was the development of sonic weapons, inspired by the lair technology first encountered on that doomed Xenos world. The Noise Marines, as they came to be known, emerged as a specialized formation within the Legion. These warriors carried weapons that weaponized sound itself, from the relatively simple sonic blasters to the more elaborate doom sirens that could liquefy internal organs while leaving armor intact. The Cacophony, an elite subset of Noise Marines, underwent additional surgical modifications to their vocal cords and respiratory systems, allowing them to produce lethal harmonics without mechanical assistance. The martial structure of the Legion fractured along with its physical cohesion. The former chain of command, once a model of meritocratic efficiency, dissolved into a fluid hierarchy based on sensory achievement rather than tactical acumen. Officers maintained authority not through demonstrated leadership, but through their ability to provide novel experiences to their subordinates. Companies became warbands centered around particular sensory obsessions, each developing distinct combat doctrines that reflected their specific fixations. Lord Commander Eidolon exemplified this new approach to leadership. His authority derived from his mastery of sonic weapons technology and the surgical modifications that allowed him to produce lethal harmonics with his enhanced vocal apparatus. The warriors under his command specialized in sensory overload tactics, using precisely calibrated sound frequencies to induce states ranging from paralytic ecstasy to terminal agony in their targets. Captain Lucius established a different power base, centered on the art of dueling. His warband consisted of swordsmen who approached combat as performance, seeking to extract maximum sensation from each engagement. They developed fighting styles that emphasized prolonged combat over efficient killing, using techniques designed to inflict precisely calibrated pain while keeping opponents conscious and aware. Lucius himself underwent extensive facial scarification, each scar commemorating a particularly satisfying kill, eventually transforming his once handsome features into a grotesque network of ritualized tissue damage. Not all emperor's children embraced these changes with equal enthusiasm. A minority faction, primarily composed of Terran-born veterans from before Fulgrim's discovery, maintained a semblance of their former discipline. These warriors, led by ancient Rylaner, attempted to preserve traditional legion practices amid the growing excesses. They were increasingly marginalized, assigned to peripheral duties, or deployed on high-risk missions with minimal support. The possessed Fulgrim regarded these traditionalists with amused contempt, allowing them to persist as a reminder of what the Legion had transcended. In private communications with his inner circle, he referred to them as necessary counterpoint, their stubborn adherence to outdated principles serving as contrast that heightened the experience of the Legion's new direction. This calculated tolerance would eventually give way to active persecution as the transformation of the Legion accelerated. The most profound aspect of the Emperor's children's corruption manifested in their relationship with the warp entity that had first touched them through the lair blade. What began as subtle influence had developed into active worship, with increasing numbers of the Legion recognizing Slaanesh as the embodiment of their pursuit of sensation. Ritual chambers appeared throughout the fleet, where warriors engaged in ceremonies designed to attract the pleasure god's attention. These rituals varied widely in form, but shared a common emphasis on sensory extremes. Some involved elaborate orchestrations of pain and pleasure, while others focused on specific sensory domains pushed beyond normal tolerance. The most dedicated practitioners reported experiencing direct communion with warp entities, receiving visions that guided their further exploration of excess. The possessed Fulgrim encouraged these practices without explicitly endorsing any particular approach. He recognized that the path to Slaanesh was inherently individualistic, each warrior finding his own route to transcendence through personal obsession. This apparent permissiveness masked a calculated strategy. By allowing multiple forms of corruption to flourish simultaneously, he prevented any single power center from emerging that might challenge his authority. The transformation of the Legion extended to its fleet operations and combat doctrine. The precision strikes and flawless execution that had once been their hallmark gave way to practices designed to maximize sensory impact rather than military effectiveness. Void engagements became opportunities for experimentation, with ship captains testing unconventional maneuvers that prioritized aesthetic experience over tactical advantage. Planetary assaults were no longer conducted according to strategic objectives, but orchestrated as sensory symphonies. Targets were selected not for their military significance, but for their potential to provide novel experiences. Worlds with unique environmental conditions or culturally sophisticated populations received particular attention, as they offered more varied sensory landscapes to explore and corrupt. The fate of the demon that had possessed Fulgrim through the lair blade represented one of the most significant developments in this period. Following the Dropsite massacre, the entity had achieved complete dominance over the Primarch's physical form, trapping Fulgrim's consciousness as a helpless observer within his own body. This arrangement proved unsustainable as the Primarch's extraordinary will gradually reasserted itself, creating an internal conflict that threatened to compromise the demon's control. The resolution came in an unexpected form. Rather than continuing their struggle for dominance, Fulgrim and the demon reached an accommodation. The Primarch, having witnessed the sensory experiences available through Slaaneshi corruption, chose to embrace rather than resist this new existence. He reclaimed control of his physical form not by expelling the demon, but by merging with it, creating a hybrid consciousness that retained Fulgrim's memories and personality while incorporating the demon's perspective and knowledge. This merger produced a being more dangerous than either component alone, a Primarch with full access to his transhuman capabilities, enhanced by demonic insight, and completely committed to the pursuit of excess. The new Fulgrim retained his tactical genius and charismatic leadership while abandoning the moral constraints that had previously governed his actions. His first act upon completing this transformation was to gather his senior officers for a celebration that degenerated into a massacre, with half the participants dead or permanently mutilated by its conclusion. The Legion's quest for new sensations led them to increasingly extreme practices. Conventional combat, even with their enhanced weapons and modified physiologies, eventually proved insufficient to satisfy their escalating needs. This drove the development of specialized torture techniques designed to extract maximum sensory data from both willing and unwilling subjects. Prisoners taken in battle were no longer treated as conventional captives, but as raw material for sensory exploration. The Legion's apothecaries, under Bile's direction, developed methods to keep subjects conscious and responsive despite catastrophic physical trauma. These techniques allowed for extended periods of experimentation, with particularly resilient specimens surviving for weeks or even months under conditions that defied conventional understanding of biological endurance. The pursuit of chemical enhancement represented another avenue of exploration. The Emperor's Children's Astartes physiology, designed to neutralize toxins and maintain optimal function regardless of environmental conditions, presented both challenge and opportunity for those seeking chemical transcendence. Bile and his associates developed compounds specifically engineered to overcome transhuman resistance, producing substances that could induce controlled neurological responses even in Astartes subjects. These combat drugs evolved from simple stimulants into complex psychoactive compounds that altered perception and emotion in precisely calibrated ways. Warriors would prepare for battle by selecting specific chemical cocktails designed to enhance particular sensory domains relevant to their planned activities. Some specialized in compounds that heightened visual acuity and color perception, while others preferred formulations that intensified tactile sensations or emotional responses. The Legion's obsession with excess inevitably affected their combat effectiveness, though not always to their detriment. While their strategic coherence deteriorated, individual warriors and small units often displayed capabilities beyond those of conventional Astartes. The combination of surgical modification, chemical enhancement, and demonic influence produced combatants capable of feats that seemed impossible by normal physiological standards. Noise Marines could maintain combat operations for days without rest, sustained by the sensory feedback from their sonic weapons. Duelists like Lucius developed reflexes that bordered on precognition, anticipating opponents' movements before they occurred. Even standard tactical Marines displayed unusual resilience, their rewired pain reception systems allowing them to function despite injuries that would incapacitate normal Astartes. These enhanced capabilities came at the cost of reliability and coordination. The Emperor's Children became increasingly unpredictable allies, as likely to abandon critical objectives in pursuit of sensory distractions, as they were to achieve spectacular victories through unconventional approaches. Other traitor legions learned to deploy them as shock troops or terror weapons, rather than counting on them for systematic campaign operations. The transformation of the Emperor's Children from the Emperor's most perfect creation into devotees of Slaanesh represented one of the most profound tragedies of the Horus Heresy. A legion created to embody humanity's highest aspirations had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and excess. Their pursuit of perfection, once admirable, had been perverted into an endless quest for sensation that recognized no limits and accepted no constraints. Among the Emperor's Children, no figure embodies the Legion's fall more completely than Chief Apothecary Fabius Bile. Once the Third Legion's most accomplished medici, Bile's transformation from healer to mutilator paralleled the corruption of the Legion itself. Before the heresy, Bile had distinguished himself during the Blight Crisis, developing treatments that saved the remnants of the Legion from extinction. His early work showed genuine brilliance. He pioneered techniques for accelerating gene seed maturation without compromising stability and created enhanced surgical protocols that improved Astartes' recovery rates by nearly 30%. The seeds of Bile's corruption were planted long before Laren, rooted in his fundamental philosophy about Astartes' physiology. Where the Emperor designed the Space Marines as the perfect balance of human and transhuman, Bile increasingly viewed the Astartes as merely transitional, an incomplete step towards something greater. His private research, conducted in sealed laboratories aboard the Andronius, focused on identifying what he termed arbitrary limitations in the Astartes genome. After Laren, these tendencies blossomed into full obsession. Bile obtained samples of the serpentine Xeno's genetic material, studying how they had modified their own bodies for enhanced sensation. His analysis revealed sophisticated bioalchemical processes that allowed the layer to rewrite their neural pathways, creating direct connections between sensory organs and pleasure centers. More significantly, he discovered evidence that these modifications were self-directed rather than evolutionary, suggesting the species had mastered biological self-determination. The Dropsite massacre provided Bile with unprecedented research opportunities. While other emperors' children claimed conventional trophies from the battlefield, Bile harvested gene seed, tissue samples, and living prisoners. Of particular interest were the unique genetic variations found in the salamanders and raven guard, whose gene lines contained distinctive traits not present in other legions. From the Iron Hands, he collected cybernetic components, especially from those warriors most heavily augmented under Ferrus Manus's philosophy of mechanical perfection. Bile established his primary laboratory aboard the Prideful Grandiosity, converting an entire deck into what he called his flesh workshops. The space bore little resemblance to a traditional apothecarian, featuring vat-grown organ clusters suspended in nutrient fluids, surgical theaters designed for experimental procedures rather than healing, and stasis chambers containing living subjects in various stages of modification. The air carried a distinctive chemical signature, a blend of preservative compounds, growth stimulants, and psychoactive substances that induced a state of heightened awareness in those exposed to it. His experimental subjects came from diverse sources. Captured loyalist Astartes provided baseline data on unmodified gene seed function. Human prisoners offered testing grounds for techniques too unstable to risk on valuable Astartes subjects. Most controversial were the volunteers from within the Emperor's children themselves, warriors who submitted to Bile's scalpels, seeking enhancements that would intensify their sensory experiences. The modifications Bile developed fell into several categories. The most basic involved amplification of existing sensory apparatus, enhanced ocular nerves that perceived a wider spectrum of light, auditory systems capable of detecting and processing sounds beyond normal range, olfactory enhancements that could identify chemical compositions through scent alone. More advanced were his neural reconfiguration procedures, which altered how sensory data was processed, creating cross-connections between different perceptual systems that resulted in synesthetic experiences. His most radical work focused on what he termed novel sensory architectures, entirely new ways of perceiving reality. These included dermal receptors sensitive to warp energies, specialized organs that could taste emotional states in nearby beings, and neural structures capable of processing multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. Such modifications often produced unpredictable results, with subjects experiencing reality in ways they lacked the vocabulary to describe. The Emperor's children eagerly embraced these enhancements, viewing them as extensions of their quest for perfection through sensation. Warriors who underwent Bile's procedures gained status within the Legion's new hierarchy, their modified bodies serving as proof of their commitment to sensory exploration. This created a feedback loop that pushed Bile toward increasingly extreme modifications to satisfy the Legion's escalating demands. Beyond individual enhancements, Bile conducted broader research into the fundamental nature of Astartes genetics. He became particularly fixated on the gene seed organs, viewing them as the Emperor's masterwork, but also as inherently flawed by their dependence on a Primarch template. In his private journals, Bile described his ambition to create true perfection, Astartes-level enhancement without the limitations imposed by the original design. This research would eventually lead to his creation of new men after the heresy, but during this period remained theoretical. While Bile's work represented the biological aspect of the Emperor's children's corruption, Lord Commander Eidolon embodied its technological expression. Once the Legion's exemplary field commander, Eidolon underwent a transformation that mirrored the Legion's fall from grace. His tactical brilliance remained intact, but became directed toward maximizing suffering rather than achieving strategic objectives. Eidolon's fascination with lair technology began during the compliance action against the Xenos species. He personally supervised the collection of their sonic weapons, recognizing potential applications beyond mere battlefield efficiency. The devices operated on principles that weaponized sound not just as physical force, but as a medium for inducing specific neurological and psychological effects. Where conventional Imperial weapons sought to destroy bodies, these sonic devices could manipulate emotions, trigger hallucinations, or induce states of paralytic ecstasy. After the Maraviglia incident, Eidolon volunteered as the first test subject for integrating this technology directly into Astartes' physiology. The procedure, performed by Bile himself, grafted specialized sound generation organs into Eidolon's throat and modified his larynx to produce frequencies impossible for normal human or even Astartes' vocal cords. The surgery was conducted without anesthesia, as Eidolon insisted on experiencing every sensation of his transformation. The result was the first of what would become known as cacophony, warriors capable of producing lethal harmonics through their enhanced vocal apparatus. Eidolon could generate sound waves powerful enough to shatter ceramite at close range, or induce hemorrhaging in unprotected human tissue at a distance. More insidiously, he could modulate these frequencies to target specific neurological systems, causing victims to experience extreme pleasure or pain before death. Building on this success, Eidolon directed the development of external sonic weapons for wider deployment within the Legion. The basic sonic blaster became standard issue for what would become known as noise marines, warriors who embraced sound as their primary weapon. These devices utilized principles reverse-engineered from lair technology, amplifying and modulating sound waves to create effects ranging from concussive blasts to precision frequency attacks that could target specific organs. More specialized was the Doom Siren, a shoulder-mounted weapon that generated omnidirectional sonic attacks capable of affecting multiple targets simultaneously. The most devastating sonic weapon, the Blastmaster, could collapse structures or liquefy internal organs while leaving armor intact, allowing victims to experience their dissolution in excruciating detail before death. Eidolon established training protocols for these new weapons that emphasized artistic application rather than mere destruction. Noise marines learned to play their weapons like musical instruments, creating compositions of death that reflected their individual aesthetic sensibilities. Combat became performance, with warriors judged not merely on their effectiveness, but on the artistry of their killing. The Lord Commander's personal combat style evolved to incorporate his sonic capabilities into traditional Astartes tactics. He would begin engagements with precisely modulated sonic attacks designed to disorient and confuse opponents, then close to melee range where his power soared, modified with oscillating energy fields that stimulated pain receptors, would finish what his voice began. His honor guard adopted similar approaches, creating battlefield experiences that assaulted all senses simultaneously. Eidolon's influence extended beyond combat doctrine to shape the Legion's new identity. He established the cacophony as an elite formation within the Emperor's children, warriors who had undergone the same vocal modifications he pioneered. These specialists served as both shock troops and ritual leaders, their enhanced voices central to the Legion's developing worship of Slaanesh. During ceremonies, they would generate harmonics that induced trance states in participants, facilitating communion with warp entities. While Bile and Eidolon represented the biological and technological aspects of the Legion's corruption, Lucius the Eternal embodied its spiritual dimension. His transformation from skilled swordsman to sadistic champion of Slaanesh traced a path through obsession, humiliation, and ultimately transcendence through excess. Before the heresy, Lucius had been recognized as perhaps the finest swordsman in the Emperor's children, his skill approaching the theoretical limits of what even an Astartes physiology could achieve. He practiced constantly, spending hours analyzing recordings of his duels to identify and eliminate inefficiencies in his technique. This perfectionism made him an exemplar of the Legion's ethos, but also planted the seeds of his downfall. His identity became so thoroughly entwined with his martial prowess that he could not conceive of himself separate from it. The turning point came during the Istvan III atrocity, where Lucius initially sided with the loyalist emperor's children under Saul Tarvitz. His defection back to the traitors stemmed not from ideological alignment, but from wounded pride. He could not bear that Tarvitz, whom he had always bested in practice cages, was receiving greater recognition for his leadership. This betrayal marked Lucius's first step towards Slaanesh, prioritizing personal gratification over duty or brotherhood. Following the drop site massacre, Lucius underwent both physical and philosophical transformation. He began modifying his armor with trophies taken from worthy opponents, focusing particularly on facial features, eyes, tongues, and skin that he incorporated into his own wargear. More significantly, he developed a new approach to dueling that emphasized prolonged combat over efficient killing. Where once he had sought the perfect kill, he now pursued the perfect experience of battle. This philosophical shift manifested in his distinctive facial scarification. After each significant victory, Lucius would carve a new scar into his face, creating an elaborate network of ritualized tissue damage. These scars served multiple purposes: trophies commemorating worthy kills, physical manifestations of his dedication to sensation, and a form of meditation on the relationship between pain and perfection. The practice transformed his once handsome features into a grotesque map of his martial history. Lucius's combat style evolved alongside his philosophy. He developed techniques designed to extend engagements, deliberately avoiding killing blows to prolong the exchange of strikes. His famous lair pattern blade work incorporated flourishes and seemingly superfluous movements that served to disorient opponents while maximizing his own sensory experience. Most disturbing was his ability to derive pleasure from wounds received as well as inflicted, turning what should have been disadvantages into sources of stimulation. This capacity for deriving pleasure from pain eventually attracted the direct attention of Slaanesh. Following a duel in which he was killed by a superior opponent, Lucius experienced the first manifestation of what would become his defining curse. The warrior who had slain him, having taken pride in the victory, found his body transforming over several days, Lucius's features emerging from his flesh until the original personality was completely subsumed. Lucius thus returned from death, his consciousness transferred to his killer's body through the mechanism of pride in the killing. This resurrection established Lucius as one of Slaanesh's chosen champions, granted conditional immortality through the gods' favor. Each subsequent death and rebirth reinforced this status, with Lucius returning whenever his killer felt even a moment's satisfaction in the deed. The knowledge of this condition changed how he approached combat, introducing an element of meta-theatrical awareness. Each duel became not just an exchange of blows, but a potential vehicle for his resurrection. Beyond these three prominent figures, several other Emperor's Children officers played significant roles in the Legion's corruption. Captain Marius Verocian, once known for his stoic adherence to protocol, became one of the first Noise Marines after extensive modification by Bile. His transformation was particularly striking given his former reserve. The warrior who had once valued silence and discipline became obsessed with sonic excess, his modified armor incorporating resonance chambers that amplified every sound he made in battle. Captain Solomon Demeter represented a different trajectory. Unlike many of his brothers, Demeter struggled against the Legion's corruption, attempting to maintain his former standards even as those around him embraced excess. This resistance ultimately proved futile. During a void engagement against loyalist vessels, he was betrayed by his own command crew, who had secretly pledged themselves to Slaanesh. Mortally wounded, Demeter was saved through Bile's experimental procedures, his body reconstructed with modifications that left him physically transformed and mentally broken, a hollow vessel for sensations he no longer wanted to experience. Most significant among those who rejected the Legion's new direction was Captain Saul Tarvitz. His decision to warn the Loyalists on Istvan III marked him as a traitor to the traitors, earning him the special enmity of Lucius and Eidolon. Tarvitz represented everything the corrupted Emperor's Children sought to leave behind: discipline, selflessness, and adherence to principles beyond personal gratification. Though presumably killed during the virus bombing of Istvan III, his example remained a rebuke to what the Legion had become, a memory deliberately erased from official records, but preserved in the bitter recollections of those who had known him. The fundamental tragedy of the Emperor's children's fall lay in how completely their virtues transformed into vices. The pursuit of perfection became the pursuit of perfect sensation. Appreciation for beauty devolved into obsession with experience at any cost. Technical mastery warped into the crafting of increasingly elaborate tortures. The Legion that had once embodied humanity's highest aspirations became a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession unconstrained by moral purpose. The Emperor's children approached the Sol system with a fleet transformed by their devotion to excess. What had once been the pristine vessels of the Third Legion now bore grotesque modifications that reflected their fall into depravity. The pride of the Emperor, renamed the Prideful Grandiosity, led this twisted armada. Its once gleaming hull was now adorned with Baroque embellishments of writhing figures and faces frozen in ecstasy or agony. Viewports had been reshaped into stained glass mosaics depicting scenes of indulgence, their colors shifting unnaturally as the light passed through materials not entirely of real space. The interior of the flagship had undergone even more dramatic alterations. Command decks, once renowned for their efficient design, now featured sensory amplification systems that transmitted the experience of void travel directly to the nervous systems of the bridge crew. Navigation officers worked amid clouds of psychoactive incense, claiming the altered states enhanced their ability to plot optimal courses through the increasingly turbulent warp. Throughout the vessel, former storage compartments and training halls had been converted to pleasure chambers, where the Legion indulged in increasingly elaborate rituals dedicated to their new patron. As the fleet navigated the outer reaches of the Sol system, they encountered the first layers of Imperial defenses. Solar monitoring stations, designed to provide early warning of approaching vessels, were systematically neutralized by Emperor's children's strike teams. Rather than simply destroying these installations, the Astartes boarded them, subjecting the crews to elaborate tortures designed to extract both information and sensation. The few survivors were modified with Fabius Bile's experimental compounds, transforming them into living navigation beacons that broadcast psychic signals guiding the traitor fleet through the system's defensive networks. Lord Commander Eidolon directed the fleet's approach, employing unconventional tactics that prioritized sensory impact over military efficiency. Rather than maintaining standard void formation, Emperor's children vessels executed complex choreographed maneuvers, creating patterns visible only when viewed across multiple dimensions. These movements served no tactical purpose, but generated resonance patterns in the warp that attracted the attention of Slaaneshi entities, who manifested in increasing numbers aboard the ships. The Imperial defensive response was hampered by confusion over the Emperor's children's intentions. The bizarre behavior of the approaching fleet, combined with their relatively small numbers compared to other traitor forces, led some Solar Command officers to misclassify them as a diversionary force rather than a significant threat. This miscalculation allowed the Third Legion to penetrate deeper into the system before encountering serious resistance. When the Emperor's children fleet reached the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, they split into smaller battle groups. While the main force continued toward Terra under Eidolon's command, several squadrons diverted to attack civilian habitats throughout the belt. These were not strategic targets, but concentrations of human life, mining colonies, research stations, and commercial outposts housing millions of Imperial citizens. The Legion fell upon these defenseless populations with methodical cruelty, treating each habitat as a laboratory for new experiences in suffering. The mining colony of Proxima Thule became the site of particularly horrific experimentation. Captain Lucius led a force of 300 Emperor's children in a lightning assault that captured the habitat intact. Rather than simply massacring the 30,000 inhabitants, Lucius instituted what he termed the ascending spiral, a regime where each level of the habitat was subjected to increasingly elaborate torments. The upper levels experienced relatively quick deaths, while deeper sections endured protracted suffering, designed to generate specific emotional and psychic resonances. The entire process was carefully monitored by noise marines, who recorded the harmonics of suffering for later incorporation into their sonic weapons. As the main fleet approached Mars, they encountered unexpected resistance. The Mechanicum civil war had left the Red Planet divided, with significant forces still loyal to the Imperium. A battle group of loyalist Mechanicum vessels moved to intercept the Emperor's children, led by the Arch Mechanicus Omnissiah's Blessing. The ensuing void battle demonstrated how completely the Third Legion's combat doctrine had transformed. Rather than focusing on efficient target neutralization, Emperor's Children vessels executed attack patterns designed to inflict maximum suffering on their opponents. Noise Marine boarding parties breached the Mechanicum vessels, targeting not critical systems but crew concentrations. Their sonic weapons proved particularly effective against the cybernetic enhancements of Mechanicum personnel, creating feedback loops in augmetic systems that translated into excruciating pain for their bearers. The Loyalist vessels were not simply destroyed, but violated, their machine spirits corrupted by demonic entities that turned the ship's own systems against their crews. The Omnissiah's Blessing, boarded by Eidolon himself, became a floating charnel house, its automated factories repurposed to process living crew members into components for obscene new augmentations. With the Mars defensive fleet neutralized, the Emperor's children continued their approach to Terra. They arrived at the throne world as part of the third wave of traitor forces, following the initial assaults by the sons of Horus and World Eaters. The planet that greeted them bore little resemblance to the shining center of human civilization it had once been. Orbital bombardments had scarred its surface, destroying significant portions of the planetary infrastructure. The atmospheric composition had been altered by chemical weapons and massive burning, creating a perpetual twilight of smoke and debris that obscured the surface from orbital view. The Legion made planetfall at multiple sites across Terra's southern hemisphere, avoiding the heavily contested zones around the Imperial Palace, where the primary traitor forces were concentrated. Their drop zones focused instead on civilian population centers, sprawling hive cities and administrative complexes that had thus far escaped the worst of the fighting. These targets offered limited strategic value, but contained millions of humans whose suffering could fuel the Legion's devotion to Slaanesh. The hive city of Nova Yoruba, with its population of 23 million, became the centerpiece of the Emperor's Children's campaign on Terra. Fabius Bile established his primary field laboratory in the upper spires, converting the former planetary governor's palace into a facility for his increasingly radical experiments. From this position, he directed specialized collection teams who moved through the hive levels, identifying and capturing subjects with genetic traits of interest. Priority was given to individuals with natural resistance to pain, unusual sensory acuity, or latent psychic potential, characteristics Bile believed could enhance his ongoing modifications of Astartes' physiology. The lower levels of Nova Yoruba experienced a different kind of horror under the direction of the Noise Marines. These districts became testing grounds for new applications of sonic technology, with entire hab blocks subjected to harmonics calibrated to induce specific psychological states. Some areas received frequencies that triggered uncontrollable aggression, causing the inhabitants to tear each other apart in frenzies of violence. Others experienced sounds that induced paralyzing pleasure, leaving victims helplessly immobile as they were harvested by Legion apothecaries. The most elaborate experiment converted a former manufacturing district into what the Noise Marines called the Symphony of Flesh, a massive composition played through the screams of thousands of victims whose nervous systems had been rewired to respond to remote stimulation. Throughout the conquered territories, the Emperor's children established ritualistic practices that blended warfare with worship of Slaanesh. Combat became performance, with warriors competing to execute kills with maximum artistry rather than efficiency. Prisoners were not simply executed, but incorporated into elaborate tableaus that remained in place for days, sustained by drugs and surgical modifications that prevented death despite catastrophic injuries. These displays served both as offerings to Slaanesh and as sources of inspiration for the legion's warriors, who would study them between engagements, incorporating new techniques into their own performances. The most significant aspect of the Emperor's Children's campaign on Terra was notable not for what occurred, but for what did not: Fulgrim's absence from the final assault on the Imperial Palace. The Primarch, increasingly detached from conventional reality following his merger with the Lair Demon, had pursued his own objectives since entering the Sol system. While his legion indulged in excess across Terra's surface, Fulgrim engaged in a personal quest that took him away from the primary conflict at the moment when his tactical brilliance might have proven decisive for the traitor forces. The exact nature of Fulgrim's activities during this period remains largely unknown. Fragmentary records suggest he led a small force of his most devoted followers to a location in Terra's southern polar region, a site of ancient significance predating even the Unification Wars. What he sought there has never been definitively established, though surviving accounts from Emperor's Children officers mention a transcendent transformation and ascension beyond flesh in their communications regarding their Primarch's absence. This absence created a significant vacuum in the traitor command structure. Without Fulgrim's strategic oversight, the Emperor's Children operated as disconnected warbands rather than a coordinated legion. Lord Commander Eidolon nominally maintained authority over their forces, but in practice, each captain pursued individual objectives based on personal obsessions rather than strategic necessity. This fragmentation severely limited the Legion's military effectiveness, despite their significant numerical presence on Terra. Horus Lupercal, observing this dissolution of one of his primary assets, made repeated attempts to redirect the Emperor's Children toward more strategically valuable targets. The Warmaster's communiques to Eidolon grew increasingly frustrated as the Third Legion continued to prioritize civilian targets over military objectives. In one particularly scathing message, Horus reminded Eidolon that sensation without purpose is merely distraction, and demanded the Emperor's Children commit their forces to the northeastern quadrant of the Imperial Palace, where the Iron Warriors were struggling to breach the Sanctum Imperialis. Eidolon's response demonstrated how completely the Legion had abandoned conventional military thinking. He dispatched a token force of 200 Astartes to the palace perimeter, but accompanied this nominal compliance with a gift that epitomized the Emperor's Children's transformation: a collection of musical instruments crafted from the nervous systems of loyalist space marines, each capable of producing sounds that could induce specific hallucinations when played correctly. The message was clear: the Legion would participate in the siege on their own terms, treating it as an opportunity for sensory exploration rather than a military objective. The Emperor's Children who did participate in the palace assault brought their altered combat doctrine to the front lines, with mixed results. Their noise marines proved surprisingly effective against the Imperial Fist's defenders, whose stoic discipline offered little protection against sonic weapons calibrated to bypass psychological defenses. Several breaches in the outer palace walls were attributed to concentrated sonic attacks that shattered both Ferrocrete and Resolve simultaneously. However, these tactical successes were rarely exploited effectively, as the Emperor's Children forces typically became distracted by opportunities for individual indulgence rather than pressing their advantages. Perhaps the most strategically significant contribution of the Emperor's Children to the siege came through their corruption of civilian defense forces in sectors adjacent to the palace. Specialized infiltration teams, enhanced with Bile's modifications for heightened pheromone production and subliminal vocal control, penetrated loyalist militia units and systematically turned them against their commanders. These subverted forces created significant disruptions in the palace's support infrastructure, diverting resources that might otherwise have reinforced critical defensive positions. As the siege progressed, the Emperor's Children's excesses intensified. The constant psychic emanations generated by their activities began affecting reality around their strongholds. In Nova Yoruba, witnesses reported architectural features spontaneously reshaping into anatomical forms, reflective surfaces showing events occurring elsewhere in the city, and ambient sounds organizing themselves into whispered promises of pleasure or power. These phenomena marked the beginning of what would later become full-fledged Slaaneshi corruption of physical space, though they remained localized during the siege itself. The behavior of individual emperors, children Astartes during this period, reflected their complete abandonment of their former identity. Warriors who had once embodied discipline and precision now pursued personal obsessions with single-minded intensity. A squad tasked with securing a communications array might become fixated on arranging the bodies of defenders in specific patterns, spending hours adjusting their positions while ignoring their actual objective. Officers would interrupt combat operations to capture particularly interesting specimens for Bial's laboratories or to record unusual sounds for incorporation into sonic compositions. This dissolution of military purpose reached its apex during the final days of the siege. As news spread of Horus's death and the traitor force's imminent defeat, most legions began executing withdrawal plans to preserve their strength. The Emperor's children, however, intensified their activities, seemingly unconcerned with escape. In Nova Yoruba, they initiated what surviving records call the cacophony, a massive ritual involving hundreds of thousands of human subjects connected to sonic amplification, devices that broadcast their experiences directly into the warp. The psychic energy generated by this event created a localized warp storm that persisted for weeks after the Legion's eventual departure, preventing Imperial forces from reclaiming the city until long after the main traitor forces had fled Terra. The Emperor's children's withdrawal from Terra, when it finally came, was as disordered as their campaign had been. Rather than executing a coordinated retreat, individual warbands departed when and how they pleased, often taking substantial collections of human captives with them. Some groups remained on Terra for days after the siege officially ended, continuing their activities in isolated enclaves until loyalist forces managed to root them out. Others departed immediately following Horus's defeat, using the confusion of the general traitor retreat to slip past blockades, with holds full of experimental subjects for Bial's continuing work. The fleet that eventually reassembled in the outer Sol system bore little resemblance to the already corrupted force that had arrived. Ships had been modified even further during their time at Terra, with some vessels so extensively altered they barely qualified as spacecraft by conventional definitions. Hull configurations shifted continuously, internal spaces expanded beyond physical dimensions, and navigation systems operated on principles more akin to sorcery than technology. These changes reflected the Legion's deeper immersion in Slaaneshi corruption, their vessels becoming extensions of their transformed consciousness rather than merely transportation. As they departed the Sol system, the Emperor's children left behind a legacy of horror unmatched by any other traitor legion. Where the World Eaters had brought swift if brutal death and the Death Guard had spread disease, the Third Legion had inflicted suffering with artistic precision, treating Terra's population as raw material for their sensory explorations. The psychological impact of their atrocities would persist for generations, with entire districts of reclaimed hive cities remaining uninhabitable due to the psychic imprints left by their rituals. More insidious was the cultural contamination they introduced. In the decades following the siege, Imperial authorities would struggle to contain outbreaks of Slaaneshi worship in regions where the Emperor's children had operated. The Legion had not simply killed, they had seduced, leaving behind converts and cultists who continued their work after their departure. These cults typically began as secret societies focused on artistic or sensory exploration, before gradually introducing more extreme practices, eventually developing into full-fledged chaos worship. The pattern became so recognizable that Imperial authorities developed specialized protocols for identifying and eliminating these aesthetic progressions before they reached their inevitable conclusion. The Emperor's children's retreat from the Sol system marked the beginning of their transformation from a unified legion into a disparate collection of warbands. Unlike other traitor legions who maintained some semblance of their former structure, the Third Legion experienced a complete organizational collapse. Their flight was not coordinated but chaotic, with individual captains and champions choosing separate destinations based on personal obsessions rather than strategic considerations. As imperial forces regrouped to pursue the retreating traitors, the emperor's children scattered across multiple retreat vectors. The largest contingent, led by Lord Commander Eidolon aboard the prideful Grandiosity, plotted a course for the Eye of Terror, that massive warp rift near the Cadian Gate where reality and the immaterium bleed together. Other significant groups headed toward the Maelstrom, the storm of the Emperor's wrath in the Ultima Segmentum, and various uncharted regions where they could continue their pursuits without immediate imperial interference. The journey to these refuges proved nearly as devastating as the defeat at Terra. Warp travel had become increasingly treacherous as the Immaterium roiled with the psychic aftermath of the heresy. Ships required substantial Gellar field modifications to maintain even minimal protection against the entities that now actively sought them out. For most traitor legions, these entities represented a threat. For the Emperor's children, they were increasingly viewed as potential allies or even objects of worship. Many vessels never reached their intended destinations. Some were lost to warp predators too powerful for even Slaaneshi patronage to deter. Others fell victim to loyalist pursuit forces, particularly White Scar's strike groups whose speed allowed them to intercept the more heavily damaged traitor ships. Most significantly, numerous Emperor's children vessels turned on each other, their commanders falling into disputes over resources, captives, or simply aesthetic differences in how they pursued their devotion to excess. By the time the bulk of the Legion reached the Eye of Terror in the early 31st millennium, their numbers had been reduced by nearly 40% from their strength at Terra. More importantly, any pretense of Legion cohesion had disappeared. The warriors who had once proudly borne the Emperor's Aquila now identified primarily through their specific obsessions and the warbands built around them. The transition from Legion to warbands was not merely organizational but philosophical. Traditional military hierarchies based on rank and battlefield achievement gave way to structures centered on sensory innovation and devotion to specific aspects of Slaanesh's patronage. A warband might form around a champion who had discovered a new method of extracting emotional resonance from victims, or a noise marine whose sonic compositions could induce previously unexperienced states of consciousness. The largest of these early warbands coalesced around the Legion's remaining senior officers. Eidolon established the Exquisite Host, comprising several thousand Astartes who followed his vision of sensation through domination. Operating from the captured Mechanicum forged ship Andronicus Rex, they specialized in planetary assaults focused on subjugating rather than destroying populations, creating sustainable sources of slaves and experimental subjects. Lucius gathered a smaller but more elite formation known as the Flawless Host. His warband attracted the Legion's most accomplished duelists and close combat specialists, warriors who viewed battle as performance art rather than military conflict. Their operations typically targeted specific high-value individuals, imperial champions, planetary governors, or others whose deaths could be elevated to aesthetic statements rather than mere killings. Perhaps most influential in the Legion's post-heresy development was Fabius Bile, whose warband evolved along unique lines. Unlike other Emperor's children leaders, Bile maintained a degree of independence from Slaaneshi worship, viewing the Chaos God as a means rather than an end. His consortium, as it came to be known, functioned more as a mobile laboratory than a traditional military force. They specialized in lightning raids against genetic repositories, research facilities, and populations with unique biological traits, always seeking new materials for Bile's continuing experiments. The first century within the Eye of Terror saw continuous evolution of these warbands as they adapted to their new environment. The unique properties of the Eye, where reality responds to desire and belief, accelerated the Emperor's children's transformation. Physical mutations that might have taken generations to manifest in real space occurred within years or even months. Warriors who obsessed over specific sensory experiences developed biological adaptations that enhanced those experiences, enhanced auditory organs that could perceive sounds beyond normal frequency ranges, optical modifications that allowed visualization of previously invisible energy spectra, or tactile sensors that could distinguish molecular-level differences in texture. This period also saw the emergence of the first noise marine covens as distinct subfactions within the Legion. Building on the sonic weapon technology first developed during the heresy, these specialists created increasingly sophisticated instruments of destruction. The Cacophony, led by the former Captain Marius Verosian, established the first formal academy of sonic warfare within the Eye, codifying techniques for weaponizing sound across multiple dimensions. Their fortress, built from the wreckage of several spacecraft fused together by warp energies, became known as the Echoing Halls, a complex where sound behaved according to non-Euclidean principles, creating acoustic effects impossible in real space. The Legion's relationship with their Primarch underwent significant changes during this period. Fulgrim, having completed his transformation into a demon prince of Slaanesh, no longer maintained direct control over his former warriors. His appearances became increasingly rare and unpredictable, manifesting to specific warbands when their activities attracted his attention rather than directing the Legion as a whole. These visitations were both coveted and feared, as the Demon Primarch's favor could elevate a warband to prominence, but often came with transformative gifts that were as much curse as blessing. By approximately 100 years after the heresy, the Emperor's children had established several major strongholds within the Eye of Terror. The largest of these was Harmony, a demon world reshaped to reflect Slaaneshi aesthetics, where reality responded directly to emotional states. Its landscape constantly reconfigured itself to maximize sensory impact, with mountains that produced harmonics when the wind blew through them, forests of crystalline trees that refracted light in mathematically perfect patterns, and oceans of psychoactive fluid that induced different states of consciousness depending on depth and temperature. The First Black Crusade in the year 780, one of the 31st millennium, provided the first opportunity for Emperor's children warbands to venture back into Imperial space in significant numbers. When Abaddon the Despoiler called for the traitor legions to join his campaign, the response from the Third Legion was fragmented but substantial. No single leader spoke for the Emperor's children, but numerous warbands recognized the opportunities presented by the crusade. Eidolon's exquisite host contributed the largest contingent, deploying nearly 2,000 Astartes to Abaddon's forces. Their participation came with conditions, however. They demanded exclusive rights to specific target worlds, where they could pursue their own objectives alongside the Crusade's military goals. This pattern would repeat in subsequent Black Crusades, with Emperor's children forces participating as allies of convenience rather than fully integrated components of Abaddon's armies. The First Black Crusade saw the Emperor's children primarily targeting civilian populations and cultural centers rather than military installations, while other traitor legions focused on destroying imperial defenses or securing strategic objectives. The Third Legion's warbands raided museums, performance venues, and population centers. The Chorus of Cacophony, a noise marine warband led by the champion Kazarax, captured the famous Cathedral of Blessed Resonance on Benediction, converting its renowned pipe organ into a sonic weapon capable of broadcasting, suffering across an entire continent. Between major Black Crusades, Emperor's children activity settled into patterns dictated by the unique obsessions of individual warbands. Unlike legions such as the World Eaters, who launched constant raids driven by bloodlust, or the Death Guard, who methodically spread disease, the Third Legion's excursions from the Eye of Terror were calculated to serve specific sensory or experimental goals. The Children of the Torment, formed during the late 32nd millennium under the leadership of Lord Skyrel, specialized in psychological warfare operations targeting Imperial leadership. Their campaigns typically began with the abduction of key individuals, planetary governors, ecclesiarchy officials, or military commanders, who would be subjected to elaborate tortures designed not merely to break them, but to transform them. These victims, their minds and bodies reconstructed according to Slaaneshi principles, would be returned to Imperial society as sleeper agents, their altered perceptions and loyalties undetectable until activated by specific sensory triggers. The Flawless Host evolved from Lucius's original warband into one of the most militarily effective Emperor's Children factions. Under the leadership of Alexis the Flawless after Lucius's disappearance in the 32nd millennium, they developed a combat doctrine that blended their legion's sensory obsessions with genuine tactical sophistication. Their warriors underwent modifications that enhanced reaction speed and sensory processing, creating fighters capable of responding to battlefield developments with preternatural swiftness. These advantages made them highly sought after as shock troops during the Third and Fourth Black Crusades, where their ability to break through Imperial defensive lines earned them considerable status among the forces of chaos. The Phoenix Conclave represented a different evolutionary path. Formed by veterans who had served in the Legion's Palatine Blades during the Great Crusade, they maintained a distorted version of the Emperor's Children's original pursuit of perfection. Their warriors still practiced the martial disciplines and cultural studies that had once defined the Legion, but with objectives twisted by chaos influence. Where they had once sought balanced development of all capabilities, they now pursued extremes, perfect mastery of specific techniques at the cost of overall effectiveness, or aesthetic achievements that sacrificed practical functionality for sensory impact. The 36th millennium saw a significant evolution in Emperor's Children combat styles with the emergence of the Violators, a warband that specialized in warp-enhanced close combat techniques. Under the leadership of Champion Volupus, they developed fighting methods that incorporated minor reality distortions into their movements. Their warriors could briefly accelerate beyond normal temporal constraints, extend their weapons' reach through localized warp bubbles, or shift their physical position by microns to avoid otherwise certain hits. These techniques spread throughout the Legion's remnants, creating a new generation of duelists whose capabilities defied conventional physical limitations. The Eighth Black Crusade in year 999 of the 37th millennium saw perhaps the most coordinated Emperor's Children involvement in any of Abaddon's campaigns. The Despoilers' focus on capturing Psykers and harvesting their energy aligned with projects being pursued by several major Emperor's Children warbands, particularly those associated with Fabius Bile's consortium. The Illuminated, a warband specializing in sensory manipulation through warp energies, contributed substantial forces to operations targeting Adeptus astra-telepathica facilities. Their techniques for extracting and preserving psychic potential from captured subjects proved valuable to Abaddon's objectives, establishing a rare instance of genuine cooperation between the Emperor's Children and the Black Legion. Throughout these millennia of raiding and corruption, the Emperor's Children continued their physical and spiritual transformation. By the late 41st millennium, few retained even a superficial resemblance to the Astartes they had once been. Their armor, originally the pristine purple and gold of the Legion, evolved into individualized expressions of their bearers' obsessions. Some incorporated sensory enhancement devices directly into their ceramic plates, creating interfaces that transmitted battlefield experiences with supernatural intensity. Others modified their armor with resonance chambers, psychic amplifiers, or chemical dispensers that released combat drugs calibrated to their specific neurochemistry. The physiological modifications pioneered by Fabius Bile continued to spread throughout the Legion's remnants, creating warriors whose transhuman nature had been pushed far beyond the Emperor's original design. Some developed additional limbs to maximize their interaction with the environment, while others incorporated xenos or demonic components into their anatomy to access sensory spectra impossible for conventional human nervous systems. The most extreme examples barely resembled humanoids at all, their bodies reconstructed as living instruments of sensation, with little regard for combat effectiveness or even basic mobility. The 13th Black Crusade brought many Emperor's Children warbands back to Imperial space in their greatest numbers since the heresy. While still not operating as a unified legion, their presence was felt across multiple sectors adjacent to the Cadian Gate. The Violators seized the pleasure world of Luxoria, transforming its leisure facilities into laboratories for sensory experimentation. The Flawless Host conducted a systematic campaign against Imperial naval assets, capturing numerous vessels to expand their fleet for deep strikes into undefended systems. Most ominously, multiple warbands associated with the consortium raided genetic repositories and research facilities throughout the Agrippina sector, securing materials for Fabius Bile's continuing work on his New Men project. With the formation of the Great Rift following the fall of Cadia, the Emperor's children found unprecedented opportunities for expansion and corruption. Systems previously protected by their distance from the Eye of Terror now lay vulnerable to direct assault through warp rifts that bypassed conventional defenses. The 13th Black Crusade had not merely weakened the Imperium militarily, but created conditions where reality itself had become more susceptible to chaos influence, a development particularly advantageous to Slaaneshi forces, whose corruption worked through sensory and emotional channels rather than direct physical confrontation. In the Imperium Nihilus, cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, entire populations turned to any source of hope or sensation to escape their desperate circumstances. Emperor's children warbands exploited this vulnerability, presenting themselves not as conquerors, but as liberators offering transcendence through experience. The Children of Excess, a warband specializing in chemical and psychic stimulation, established cults on over 30 worlds in the Coronid Deeps, creating a network of corruption that spread through commercial and cultural channels rather than military conquest. The formation of the Great Rift fundamentally altered the Emperor's children's operations across the galaxy. Where once they had been constrained primarily to launching raids from the Eye of Terror, now they could strike almost anywhere through countless warp tiers that riddled real space. The fractured nature of the Imperium created perfect conditions for the Third Legion's particular brand of corruption to flourish. In the immediate aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade, Emperor's children warbands emerged in unprecedented numbers across both halves of the divided Imperium. The exquisite host, still led by the seemingly immortal Lord Commander Eidolon, launched a series of coordinated strikes against Imperial Shrine worlds in the Ultima Segmentum. Their target selection revealed a calculated strategy beyond mere hedonistic raiding. By desecrating sites of Imperial faith, they created psychic wounds in the collective consciousness of nearby populations, making them more susceptible to Slaaneshi influence. The Imperium Nihilus proved particularly vulnerable to their corruption. Cut off from the Astronomicon and with Imperial authority fragmented, entire sectors fell into desperation. The Children of the Torment exploited this psychological vulnerability by presenting themselves as saviors rather than conquerors. Their emissaries infiltrated struggling hive worlds, offering chemical and sensory solutions to populations suffering from resource deprivation and constant fear. What began as simple stimulant addiction often evolved into full Slaaneshi cult activity within months, the desperate citizens embracing any escape from their grim reality. The material culture of the Emperor's children in the 41st millennium reflects their 10,000-year evolution away from imperial standards. Their wargear, once the most immaculately maintained among all Astartes, now serves as canvas for their obsessions. Power armor has become highly individualized, with no two warriors bearing identical modifications. The basic Mark IV Maximus pattern that once dominated the Legion has been altered beyond recognition with Baroque additions, sensory enhancement devices, and components harvested from both Xenos technology and Imperial relics. Most distinctive among their equipment are the sonic weapons that have become synonymous with the Legion. These devices have evolved far beyond the crude adaptations of lair technology first deployed during the Heresy. Modern sonic blasters utilize psychically attuned crystals that respond to their wielder's emotional state, modulating output to create harmonics that affect not just physical matter, but the victim's perception of reality itself. The most advanced versions, typically wielded by veteran noise marines, can create localized reality distortions where sound behaves according to non-Euclidean principles, allowing impossible acoustic effects that bypass conventional defenses. The Doom Siren, mounted on the shoulder of elite noise marines, has developed into a weapon of frightening versatility. No longer merely generating overwhelming volume, modern variants can produce precisely calibrated frequencies that target specific physiological and psychological vulnerabilities. Against unprotected human targets, These weapons can induce states ranging from paralytic ecstasy to suicidal despair, allowing Emperor's Children forces to manipulate enemy morale and behavior with surgical precision. Most devastating is the Blastmaster, a heavy sonic weapon that has become increasingly rare but catastrophically effective. These devices, which require extensive modification of their bearer's nervous system to operate properly, generate sound waves that exist simultaneously in real space and the warp. The resulting harmonics can destabilize the very boundary between dimensions, causing localized reality fractures that manifest as both physical destruction and psychic trauma. Imperial defense protocols classify Blastmaster operators as priority targets, to be eliminated even at the cost of significant casualties. Beyond weapons, the Emperor's Children's equipment includes an array of combat stimulants and sensory enhancement drugs unknown to Imperial science. The basic combat stims used by loyal Astartes pale in comparison to the compounds developed by Fabius Bile and his disciples over millennia of experimentation. These substances don't merely enhance strength or reaction time, but fundamentally alter how the user experiences reality, creating states of consciousness specifically optimized for different combat scenarios. The compound known as Symphora exemplifies this approach. Unlike simple combat stimulants, Symphora creates a synesthetic state where sensory inputs cross between different perceptual systems. Users see sound as color patterns, feel kinetic impacts as musical notes, and process visual data through multiple temporal frames simultaneously. This altered consciousness allows for reaction speeds and coordination impossible under normal perception, though extended use causes permanent neurological modifications that render the user increasingly dependent on sensory extremes. More exotic is warpless, a psychoactive substance that temporarily attunes the user's nervous system to Slaneshi warp currents. Warriors under its influence experience a form of precognition specific to imminent sensations, not seeing the future in a strategic sense, but knowing exactly how each action will feel before it occurs. This allows for optimization of experience rather than tactical advantage, though the two sometimes align. The substance is highly addictive, with withdrawal symptoms including a deadening of all sensation that many Emperor's Children find worse than death. The armor worn by Emperor's Children has incorporated warp-infused materials to an extent unseen in other traitor legions. Where World Eaters might add brass inscribed with cornate symbols, or Death Guard might allow Nurglite corruption to fester in their plate, the Third Legion actively cultivates armor that responds to and enhances sensation. Ceramic components are often replaced with materials that cannot exist in real space without constant psychic reinforcement, living metals that adjust their density based on the wearer's emotional state, crystalline components that amplify and broadcast sensory experiences to nearby allies, or psychoreactive coatings that change color and pattern to reflect the intensity of combat. The most heavily modified Emperor's Children warriors wear what Imperial Ordo Hereticus reports classify as second skin armor, protection systems that have merged with the Astartes' own flesh to the point where the distinction between armor and body has become meaningless. These hybrid systems respond to both conscious control and unconscious desire, reconfiguring to optimize whatever experience the wearer currently seeks. In combat, they might form bladed protrusions or ballistic shields. During rituals, they could develop sensory apparatus or interfaces for connecting to other participants. The Legion's fleet assets have undergone similarly extensive modifications. The vessels that fled Terra after the siege bore little resemblance to standard Imperial ships. 10 millennia later, they have evolved into entities that naval tacticians struggle to classify as spacecraft at all. The largest remaining Emperor's Children vessels, including Eidolon's flagship Endless Ecstasy, exist partially in the warp at all times. Their internal dimensions shift according to no recognizable pattern, with corridors that double back on themselves impossibly and chambers that occupy the same space at different temporal coordinates. These vessels employ propulsion systems that utilize the psychic emanations of their crew and captives, converting sensation and emotion directly into motive force. The efficiency of such systems fluctuates wildly based on the emotional state aboard the ship, making their tactical behavior difficult to predict. During periods of maximum stimulation, often deliberately induced through combat drugs or ritual activity, Emperor's Children vessels can achieve acceleration and maneuverability that conventional Imperial ships cannot match, executing course changes that appear to violate fundamental laws of physics. In the years following the creation of the Great Rift, several significant Emperor's Children incursions have demonstrated their evolved tactical approach. The invasion of Ravenburg in early 42nd millennium showcased their ability to corrupt entire populations through sensory manipulation. Rather than conventional military conquest, the Flawless Host deployed modified Vox broadcasters throughout the planet's major population centers, transmitting harmonics that induced heightened suggestibility and sensory sensitivity. Within weeks, Imperial authorities reported widespread abandonment of duties as citizens became obsessed with pursuing increasingly extreme experiences. By the time Space Marines from the Angels Resplendent chapter responded, nearly 60% of the population had joined Slaaneshi cults or succumbed to sensory pursuit psychosis. The torment of Connor during the Plague Wars revealed the Emperor's Children's willingness to operate alongside other Chaos factions when convenient. While Death Guard forces engaged Ultramarines defenders directly, Emperor's Children warbands infiltrated civilian centers, establishing corruption networks that undermined Imperial morale and command structures. The two traitor legions maintained a relationship of mutual distaste but tactical cooperation, their fundamentally opposed philosophies temporarily set aside in service to the broader goals of chaos. Most alarming to Imperial authorities was the harmonious descent operation in the Nephilim sector in 21st year of the 42nd millennium. Three major Emperor's Children warbands, the Visceral Experience, the Perfect Chorus, and elements of the Exquisite Host, coordinated their activities to a degree unseen since the heresy. Their campaign targeted the sector's communication and cultural exchange infrastructure rather than military assets, replacing legitimate data streams with corrupted content that included subliminal Slaaneshi imagery and psychically active audio components. By the time the corruption was discovered, thousands of Imperial officials had been exposed to material that altered their perception and decision-making processes. The subsequent purge by Ordo Hereticus forces caused almost as much damage to sector governance as the original corruption. The current status of Fulgrim remains one of the most significant unknowns regarding the Emperor's Children. After ascending to demonhood, the Primarch retreated deep into the Eye of Terror, establishing a demon world known as Kallax, where he pursued his own inscrutable objectives. His appearances among his former legion became increasingly rare through the millennia, with the last confirmed manifestation occurring during the 34th millennium, when he briefly led the Radiant Sovereign Warband in a campaign against an exotite Eldar world. This long absence led many to believe that Fulgrim had lost interest in real space entirely, focusing instead on the great game of chaos within the warp. However, multiple reports following the formation of the Great Rift suggest the Demon Primarch may have returned. The most credible account comes from the Adeptus Custod's defense of the Hexenworld Colossi, where survivors described facing a serpentine entity of impossible beauty that matched Fulgrim's known demon form. The creature displayed tactical acumen consistent with Primarch-level intellect, nearly overwhelming the custodian forces before mysteriously withdrawing at the moment of apparent victory. Similar reports have emerged from at least 7 other conflict zones across the Imperium Nihilus, suggesting a pattern of testing appearances rather than committed engagement. Inquisitorial analysis indicates these may be preparatory actions for a larger-scale return, with Fulgrim assessing Imperial capabilities and vulnerabilities before committing to a major campaign. Of particular concern are accounts from the Machorda Sound, where Emperor's Children forces have been systematically raiding Adeptus Mechanicus gene repositories, with patterns suggesting the collection of specific genetic markers. The possibility of Fulgrim's return has profound implications for the Emperor's Children's future. Currently fragmented into hundreds of warbands, the Legion lacks the unified purpose and direction seen in more cohesive traitor forces like the Death Guard. A returning Primarch could potentially reunite these disparate elements into a coordinated force, transforming them from a collection of raiders and corruptors into a strategic threat comparable to their heresy-era capabilities. Certain Emperor's Children warbands appear to be actively preparing for such a reunification. The exquisite host has been systematically eliminating or absorbing smaller Emperor's Children factions throughout the regions surrounding the Eye of Terror, consolidating power in what some observers interpret as preparation for Fulgrim's return. Meanwhile, the Flawless Host has intensified its raiding against Imperial naval assets, capturing vessels that could form the nucleus of a Legion-scale fleet if properly consolidated. Most concerning to Imperial strategists is the apparent coordination between these activities and the operations of the Consortium Fabius Biles network of genetic laboratories and research facilities. Long operating as an independent entity with goals distinct from typical Slaaneshi objectives, the Consortium has recently shifted its collection priorities toward materials associated with Primarch physiology. Multiple raids against highly secured Adeptus Mechanicus facilities have targeted ancient genetic templates dating back to the Great Crusade era, suggesting a project related to Primarch biology. As the era Indomitus unfolds, the Emperor's Children represent a threat unlike any other chaos force. Where Cornate warbands bring straightforward violence and Nurglite forces spread physical corruption, the Third Legion attacks the Imperium's cultural and psychological foundations. Their corruption spreads through pleasure and sensation rather than force or disease, making it particularly difficult to combat in an Imperium already strained to breaking point. If the scattered warbands were to reunite under Fulgrim's leadership, they could potentially transform from a persistent menace into an existential threat to Imperial worlds throughout the galaxy. The Emperor's Children's journey from the Emperor's most perfect creation to heralds of excess stands as perhaps the most profound tragedy of the Horus Heresy. A legion created to embody humanity's highest aspirations fell through the very perfectionism that once defined them. Their pursuit of flawless execution corrupted into an endless chase for perfect sensation. In the 41st millennium, they continue this dark evolution, their every action a twisted reflection of the excellence they once represented, a living reminder that the path to damnation often begins with the noblest of intentions.